Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Laura, and for years I had felt like I was drowning in routine. Work, daily responsibilities, the city full of noise, everything had become so overwhelming that I felt my soul was slowly fading away amid the monotony of Washington, D.C. life. The metro commute, the endless meetings, the constant pressure of deadlines, the never-ending cycle of emails and conference calls. So when my friend Mariana offered me the opportunity to spend a weekend at an isolated cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, I decided it was the perfect opportunity to disconnect and escape from everything. I wasn't thinking about anything other than resting, breathing fresh mountain air, and forgetting everything that was overwhelming me. However, what I found there wasn't rest or peace, but something much more disturbing. Friday afternoon, after a long drive through winding mountain roads, I finally arrived at the cabin. It was located in the deepest part of a dense forest, about 3 hours from the city. There was no cell phone signal, which for me was a blessing, as it would allow me to completely forget about daily worries. The cabin itself was small but cozy, built of weathered wood, with windows that looked out onto a clearing where sunlight filtered through the trees, creating an almost magical effect. From the outside, it seemed like the very image of tranquility. A small stone chimney, a wooden deck where you could see a pair of rustic chairs, and around it, the forest covering everything like a protective blanket. At first, everything was in its place. There was nothing that made me suspect something wasn't right. The cabin had a wood aroma that I found comforting, and the sound of wind moving the tree branches gave me a feeling of peace I hadn't experienced in years. When I entered, I noticed everything was carefully prepared, as if someone had anticipated my arrival. The beds made, the fireplace ready to light, a small handwritten note left on the table welcoming me. Mariana had been very thoughtful in organizing everything. I spent the first day exploring the cabin, enjoying the calm that surrounded me. I sat on the porch and read for hours, interrupted only by the song of cardinals and blue jays and the occasional creaking of tree branches. I felt free, liberated from the weight of the city. That night I lit the fireplace and prepared a simple dinner. I was so relaxed that I fell asleep quickly, wrapped by the warmth of the crackling flame and the sound of nature that slipped through the windows. But it was the next day when things began to happen that made me feel uncomfortable. Upon waking, I got up from bed, stretched, and went to the kitchen to prepare some breakfast. While I was doing it, I glanced through the windows. What I saw puzzled me a bit. One of the living room windows that I was sure I had closed the night before was now slightly open. I thought maybe it had been an oversight on my part, although I didn't remember leaving it open. I closed it again, shook my head, and told myself I was probably thinking too much about unimportant things. After all, I was alone in the forest, with no one around. Who else could have been there? That day I spent walking the nearby trails, exploring a bit more of the forest. As I advanced, I couldn't stop feeling watched, as if something was lurking in the shadows. The feeling was fleeting, and I tried not to give it importance, but something inside me said not everything was right. Nevertheless, I decided to ignore it. It was time to enjoy the place and relax, wasn't it? However, upon returning to the cabin at the end of the afternoon, I found another surprise. It wasn't anything big, but it was enough to put me on alert. The window I had closed in the morning was now completely open. This time, the feeling of discomfort intensified. I approached the window and closed it firmly, thinking maybe I was being paranoid. But at the same time, I couldn't avoid the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. I felt someone else had been there, moving through the house without me knowing. To calm down, I decided to light the fireplace again and prepare a hot drink. While I sat by the fire, I observed the cabin's interior more carefully. Something didn't add up, something I couldn't identify, but that put my nerves on edge. The cabin was too tidy, too perfect. Even the small things, like the cushions on the sofa or the utensils in the kitchen, seemed to be in their place in a too calculated manner. It wasn't as if someone had lived there recently, but everything was placed in a way that could only have been prepared for my arrival. That night, the wind outside was strong, and the tree branches collided with each other, producing a constant sound. I tried to rest, but I woke up several times during the night, restless, unable to sleep well. The next morning, the feeling of discomfort remained latent, like an invisible presence that stalked me. But what really made me panic occurred when I decided to go to the bathroom. The bathroom was at the back of the cabin, just after a small hallway. When I entered, I noticed something strange. In the mirror that hung in front of the sink, there was a fingerprint clearly visible in the lower part of the glass. It wasn't a fingerprint that belonged to me, since I hadn't touched the mirror at any time. Besides, the fingerprint was fresh, as if someone had left it there recently. My mind began to race with dark thoughts. It was possible someone had been in the cabin while I was sleeping. But how? There were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were closed. And if the fingerprint wasn't from someone from outside, but from someone who had been there before, someone who had left their mark without me knowing. My paranoia increased, and I started checking every corner of the cabin, opening and closing doors, looking under beds and in closets. Everything seemed to be in its place, but there was something I couldn't ignore, a strange sensation that someone had been there before me. I couldn't shake the idea that the cabin wasn't as empty as I thought. Besides, there was something in the air, an invisible heaviness that followed me wherever I went. I decided to go for a walk in the forest again, but my mind wouldn't stop wandering. The idea that someone else had been in that place before me consumed me. During the walk, I found a small cave at the edge of the forest, a place I hadn't noticed before. Something impelled me to enter, as if somehow I needed to understand what was happening. But what I saw there chilled my blood. On the cave floor, there was a pile of scattered objects, old clothes, some broken utensils, and even a small oil lamp. What disturbed me most were the crumpled papers I found in a corner. I unfolded them cautiously and saw they were full of scribbles and strange drawings. Some of them of human figures, others of symbols I didn't recognize. On the edge of one of those papers, almost like a signature, there was a word written, Laura, my name. That was the moment when anxiety transformed into terror. How did that person know my name, who had left those papers there? And most disturbing of all, why? I felt as if something was watching me, as if the answer to all my questions was there in the back of that cave, waiting to be discovered. That night, I returned to the cabin trembling, unable to stop looking around. I sat in the living room with the lamp lit and spent the rest of the night without sleeping. I couldn't leave there. I couldn't keep ignoring what I had found, but I also knew I couldn't stay longer in that place. The cabin was no longer a refuge, no longer a place to escape from routine. It was a place where someone was waiting for me. The realization that my retreat had been anticipated, planned, orchestrated by someone unknown filled me with a dread I'd never experienced. The next day, I packed my things with shaking hands and left as quickly as I could. During the drive back to DC, every mile couldn't come fast enough. The familiar sights of suburban Virginia, the strip malls and gas stations, had never looked so welcoming. But even now, back in my apartment in the city, surrounded by the comforting noise of traffic and neighbors, I sometimes find myself checking the locks on my doors and windows. Because I learned something terrifying in those Blue Ridge Mountains. Sometimes the escape you think you need is exactly what someone else is counting on. Sometimes your desire for solitude makes you the perfect target for someone who's been waiting, watching, planning. And sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is exactly where you thought you'd be safest. Alone, isolated, and completely cut off from help. I never found out who had been waiting for me in that cabin, or why they knew I was coming. But I know one thing for certain: my name written on that paper wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been expecting Laura to come to that mountain refuge. And I have the terrifying feeling that if I hadn't left when I did, I might never have left at all. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Michael, and I've always been someone who enjoys moments of solitude. The city, with its constant noise and frantic pace, sometimes felt suffocating. So when I had the opportunity to spend a weekend at an isolated cabin in the Cascade Mountains of Washington, I accepted without thinking twice. My friend Jake had rented the place with the intention of disconnecting from everything and invited me to join him. At first, it seemed like the perfect plan. A weekend of tranquility, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and ancient cedars, without worries or the constant buzz of smartphones and traffic. The cabin was located in the foothills of a small mountain range, about 2 hours by car from the nearest town of Cedar Falls. It was a remote place where the only sounds you could hear were the whisper of leaves moved by the mountain wind and the distant call of Pacific wrens and Steller's jays. Nothing more. We arrived on Friday afternoon, just as the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks. The cabin was made of weathered cedar logs, with a steep roof and large picture windows that offered a spectacular view of the surrounding old-growth forest. There was a small wraparound porch with Adirondack chairs and a stone fireplace inside. A perfect place to relax and escape from the stress of our tech jobs back in Seattle. The first day passed almost idyllically. Jake and I took a hike through the surrounding trails, following paths marked by the Forest Service, collecting kindling for the fireplace, and spending the afternoon talking about everything from our college days to our dreams of escaping the corporate grind. Dinner was simple mac and cheese, with craft beer from a local brewery we'd picked up on the drive. Afterward, we sat by the fire, playing cards and laughing without a care in the world. However, as the night progressed, there began to be a slight feeling of unease in the air, though I couldn't identify it. Perhaps it was just the silence of the Pacific Northwest forest, so dense it made you feel like everything around you was waiting for something. The kind of silence that city dwellers like us weren't used to. No distant highway hum, no air conditioners, no late-night sirens. But I ignored it, thinking it was just my mind adjusting to the quietude of the mountain night. The next morning, we decided to explore the cabin's surroundings more thoroughly. We took a couple of backpacks with water bottles, energy bars, and a topographical map of the area, then set out on the trail that led deeper into the forest. The first few hours were peaceful, walking among the massive conifers, breathing in the crisp mountain air scented with pine and moss, enjoying the absolute peace that only the American wilderness can provide. But as the day wore on, something began to catch my attention, something subtle but present. It was as if the air was slightly heavier, as if the forest floor itself had a presence I wasn't aware of. The usual forest sounds seemed muted, and even the squirrels and chipmunks that should have been active were nowhere to be seen. I didn't mention it to Jake because I didn't want to alarm him, but the sensation wouldn't leave me alone. We returned to the cabin at the end of the afternoon when darkness was beginning to fall. Jake was in good spirits, tired from the hike, but I couldn't stop looking at the ground around us. At first, I didn't notice, but when I approached the cabin, I realized something wasn't right. There were tracks in the soft forest soil. At first, I thought they were from animals, maybe deer or elk, or perhaps a black bear that had wandered through. But something didn't fit. The tracks were too large, and stranger still, they seemed to form a circle around the cabin. I observed them carefully, trying to understand what I was seeing. But the sun was already setting behind the mountain ridges, and the light was beginning to fade. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, noticing I had stopped at the entrance. "Nothing," I replied, trying to hide the growing discomfort I felt. "Just looks like some animal passed through here." Jake glanced at the tracks but didn't pay much attention. He shrugged and entered the cabin, leaving the door open. I couldn't stop staring at them. They were deeper than they should have been for any native wildlife. And the pattern wasn't that of a single animal moving naturally through its territory. These weren't paw prints or hoof marks, but something larger, as if someone had walked around the cabin, following an almost precise trajectory. I decided it wasn't worth worrying Jake, so I closed the door and tried to forget what I had seen. That night, after dinner, we sat by the fire, playing poker and enjoying a couple of rainier beers. But while we chatted about work and old friends from our University of Washington days, I couldn't help but glance toward the windows. Every time a gust of mountain wind made the cabin's timber creak, I felt as if something was lurking in the darkness outside. A couple of times I heard noises outside, like something moving among the trees. The kind of sounds that could be a raccoon foraging or branches settling, but somehow felt different, more deliberate. But I didn't say anything to Jake. Before going to bed, Jake offered to go out on the porch to smoke a cigarette. I accompanied him for a moment, but I couldn't help looking toward the forest, toward the darkness that surrounded us. I couldn't see anything beyond the circle of light from our porch lamp, but I felt as if something was watching us from between the massive tree trunks. At first, I tried to think it was fatigue playing with my mind, but the feeling of being observed wouldn't disappear. The darkness seemed to press in on us, thick and alive in a way that urban darkness never was. "You okay?" Jake asked, noticing I was staying silent. "Yeah, it's just the silence. It's so complete, you know," I replied, trying to downplay it. "It's just the forest, Michael. Out here, everything is vast and quiet," he said, giving me a pat on the back. "That's what we came for, right? To get away from all the noise." We returned to the cabin and prepared for sleep. But that night, when the lights went out and everything fell silent, something woke me. It was a soft sound, almost imperceptible, but I heard it clearly. A cracking followed by another, as if someone was walking near the cabin, moving carefully among the shadows, stepping on the bed of pine needles and fallen branches. I jumped up, my heart beating fast, but I didn't want to wake Jake. I thought maybe it was an animal, perhaps a deer or some other forest creature. However, when I heard the cracking again, something inside me said it wasn't an animal. The rhythm was wrong, too measured, too purposeful. I got up from bed quietly and approached the window. I looked outside, trying to see something in the darkness. I saw nothing at first. The cabin was surrounded by blackness, just dark trees and more silence. But then I saw something that chilled my blood. It was a figure in the distance, barely visible among the trees. It wasn't moving, but it was there, watching. The figure wasn't large or small. It was simply standing, motionless, about 60 feet from the cabin. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadow darker than the surrounding forest. The shape was distinctly humanoid, but something about its stillness was unnatural. No person would stand that motionless for so long in the cold mountain air. I felt a knot in my stomach and quickly moved away from the window. The air in the room became thick and cold, despite the dying embers in the fireplace. My mind began to race. Was there someone outside? Or was it a hallucination brought on by too much isolation and too many urban legends about the Pacific Northwest wilderness? I decided to go outside. I couldn't stay there without knowing what was happening. I took the heavy-duty flashlight that was by the door and stepped onto the porch. The mountain darkness enveloped me, but what disturbed me most was the absolute silence. Even the night sounds you'd expect, owls, rustling small animals, the distant call of coyotes, were absent. I walked toward the edge of the forest, trying to see any sign of the figure I had seen, but the forest was empty, completely still. Only the sound of my footsteps on the carpet of pine needles broke the silence. I crouched down to examine the ground, and there it was. More tracks, this time much closer to the cabin. Deep impressions, as if something or someone very heavy had walked around, following the same circular pattern once again. But these tracks were different from the ones I'd seen earlier. They were fresher, the edges sharp in the soft soil, and they were definitely not from any animal I knew. The shape was too elongated, too human-like, but larger than any normal person's footprint. I looked around, but saw nothing except the vast darkness of the Cascade Forest. Ancient trees towered above me like silent sentinels, their branches creating a canopy so thick that no starlight penetrated. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. I quickly returned to the cabin, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't process. Upon entering, I woke Jake, but told him it was nothing, that I had heard a noise and gotten worried. However, he got up with the same feeling of unease that I was experiencing, though we didn't say it out loud. The night passed without further incidents, but the next day wasn't better. The tracks were still there, clearer than ever. Somehow, those tracks seemed to be getting closer to the cabin each time I looked. Jake and I decided to stay a bit longer, thinking maybe someone had been playing with us, perhaps local kids or hunters trying to spook the city folks. But fear was growing every minute. The tracks weren't from an animal. They were too large, too human, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. We spent the day trying to act normal, hiking a different trail, cooking an elaborate lunch, playing more cards. But both of us kept glancing toward the windows, and our conversations grew shorter, more forced. The forest that had seemed welcoming the first day now felt oppressive, watching. Finally, on the third day, when the strange noises became more frequent, and the feeling of being watched never disappeared, we decided to abandon the cabin. The final straw came when we found more tracks, not just around the cabin now, but leading right up to our windows, as if something had been peering inside while we slept. I didn't know if what I had experienced was real or a product of paranoia, but the truth was we weren't willing to stay there to find out. We packed quickly, barely speaking, just throwing our things into our bags with urgent efficiency. We never returned to that cabin. And though I try to forget what happened, every time I pass near a forest or find myself in the quietude of nature, I feel that same sensation of being watched, as if something is still lurking among the trees, waiting in silence. Even back in Seattle, surrounded by the comforting noise of urban life, sometimes late at night, I find myself listening for that soft cracking sound, wondering if something followed us home from those dark mountains. My name is Ryan. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 3 years my life has been chaos. I work as a graphic designer at an agency in Manhattan that, for some reason I can't understand, never stops. The stress, constant demands, and noise of New York City were drowning me. My head was full of noise, emails, meetings, deadlines, the constant honking of taxis, construction sounds, sirens at all hours. I felt like I was losing my ability to breathe, to think about anything other than work and the relentless pace of the city. In a desperate attempt to disconnect, I decided to do something drastic. I wanted a break from all of that, a total disconnection. So I searched for a remote place in the middle of nowhere to spend a few days alone, just me and my thoughts. I found a mountain cabin about 200 miles north of the city, in the Adirondack Mountains, surrounded by dense forest, far from any cell towers or Wi-Fi signals. The place seemed perfect, simple, isolated, and most importantly, removed from the life I had been living. The owner, an elderly man named Sebastian, gave me the coordinates and explained how to get there. He didn't talk much about the place, just told me it was a good spot to relax and that it was very quiet. What intrigued me, however, was the way he avoided talking more about the cabin. It wasn't as if he wanted to hide something, but his tone of voice changed slightly when he mentioned the name of the place. There was something in his eyes, a brief hesitation when I asked about previous guests or local wildlife. Without thinking too much about it, I took it as an eccentricity of someone older. I packed my things: laptops, sketchbooks, enough food for a week, some good bourbon, and set off on the journey, ignoring any negative thoughts. The cabin was situated on a small hill, surrounded by pine and birch trees that seemed to have been growing for centuries. The drive there took me through increasingly remote areas of upstate New York. past small towns with names like Speculator and Indian Lake, until I was on dirt roads that hadn't seen recent maintenance. At first, the place seemed perfect to me. The crisp mountain air, the sound of birds I couldn't identify, the crunch of autumn leaves under my feet. Everything was a relief from the concrete and steel of Manhattan. I entered the cabin, which had a rustic and cozy air, but with a touch of abandonment that spoke of infrequent use. The furniture was old, but well maintained, a leather sofa that probably dated from the 1970s, wooden walls with marks of wear that told stories, but nothing that seemed disturbing to me. There was a fieldstone fireplace in one corner, a comfortable old armchair, and a window that looked out onto the forest. Everything in its place, but with a strange feeling of being outside of time. At first, everything was perfect. I spent my days reading, sketching, and enjoying the absolute peace I hadn't had in years. The cabin had no electricity, just a couple of oil lamps and a candle in each room, but that didn't bother me. Somehow, the lack of technology was a blessing. No email notifications, no social media, no constant buzz of modern life. The first night I felt more relaxed than I had in a long time. The dim light of the lamps gave me a cozy feeling, and the sound of wind through the trees lulled me to sleep. However, on the third day, strange things began to happen. It was a quiet afternoon. I was sitting by the fireplace with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the flames dance. Suddenly, I heard a sound coming from upstairs, a slight creaking, as if something had fallen. I thought it could be some animal that had gotten into the cabin, since the place wasn't completely sealed, and there were gaps where creatures could slip in squirrels, maybe a raccoon. I got up and climbed the stairs to check. The hallway was empty, and there were no signs that anything had fallen, just the heavy mountain air and overwhelming silence. I decided not to give it much importance, but something made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't know what it was, but it was as if the place breathed somehow, as if the cabin itself was alive. That night, as I settled into bed, I started to hear something else. At first, I thought it was my own thoughts or the creaking of wood settling. But then I realized it wasn't the sound of the house adjusting. It was something out of place. Soft noises like footsteps dragging across the hallway. At first, I convinced myself it was my nerves, the absolute silence of the mountains, or maybe rodents in the attic. But hearing the sound closer, doubt began to settle in my mind. I got up from bed and went out into the hallway with my heart racing. The hallway was empty and the house in absolute silence. I approached the stairs, but saw nothing strange. I returned to my room, though now I felt something wasn't right. I tried to sleep, but the noises continued. Whispers, scratching, as if someone was walking through the house, moving in the darkness. At that moment, my instinct told me I wasn't alone. That sensation, that presence I couldn't see but could feel, terrified me. However, I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks: the exhaustion, the loneliness, the adjustment from city noise to mountain silence. All of that must have been affecting my perception. The next morning, everything seemed to be in order. I went into the forest to walk, trying to clear my mind. The Adirondack wilderness was beautiful, massive maples and oaks showing their fall colors, the distant sound of a stream, the rustle of deer moving through the underbrush. But the day passed quickly, and when night fell, I heard the same noises again. This time the sound didn't come from upstairs, but from the ground floor. At first I ignored them, but the longer time passed, the closer they seemed to be. I decided to investigate. I got up from bed and headed toward the stairs cautiously. The noises were clearer now, more distinct. They seemed like slow, heavy steps dragging across the wooden floor. I looked down at the ground floor, searching for the origin of the sound. The light from the oil lamps cast strange shadows on the walls, making familiar objects look menacing. I looked around, but saw no one. When I reached the living room, I noticed something strange. The wooden coffee table was moved, as if someone had pushed it forcefully. I crouched down to see if there was anything underneath, but found nothing. However, when I turned around, I saw something that chilled my blood. On the right wall, right next to the fireplace, there was a small mark, like a drawing made with something sharp. I approached slowly. It looked like a human figure, a shape that had been carved into the wood. But what was most disturbing was that the details seemed recent, as if someone had made it not long ago. My mind began to become a whirlwind. Who had been in the cabin? And why had Sebastian never mentioned it? And what was that figure on the wall? That night the noises became more intense. Not just footsteps, but whispers, as if someone was speaking in another language. I heard them coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from everywhere. At first I tried to ignore them, but they soon became louder. I felt as if everything around me was coming to life, as if the cabin itself was whispering something to me that I didn't want to hear. The whispers seemed to be in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. Terrified, I got up from bed and ran toward the door. But when I reached the entrance, something stopped me. The door, which had been locked, was now open. A freezing cold ran down my spine. Who had opened the door? How could it be if I was sure I had locked it? The mountain air rushed in, carrying scents of pine and something else, something organic and unpleasant. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I dressed quickly, grabbed my things, and went outside. The cold mountain air hit me, but at least I felt a little safer outside than in that cabin. However, looking back at the cabin, I noticed something even stranger. In the upstairs window, I saw a figure, a dark outline watching me. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't my mind playing tricks. There, in that window, there was someone, and I knew I wasn't alone. I ran without looking back. The forest seemed to swallow me as I moved away, and every step I took felt like something was chasing me. That presence wouldn't let me escape. The darkness between the trees seemed alive, reaching for me with invisible fingers. When I reached the car, I got in quickly and started the engine. I didn't look back, I couldn't. During the trip back to the city, I tried to calm down, but I couldn't help thinking about what had happened. The figure in the window, the whispers, the mark on the wall. Everything was too real to be a simple hallucination. The memory stayed with me during the entire drive down the interstate, even as the familiar glow of the city began to appear on the horizon. I never went back to the cabin. I didn't dare return. Sebastian never mentioned anything about the place when I called to tell him I was leaving early, and I never found out why that house was so isolated, so unprotected. Sometimes when I pass through rural areas outside the city, the memory of that cabin assaults me. The feeling of not being alone, of being watched, haunts me. I don't know if what I experienced was real, or if it was a product of fear and isolation. But what I know is that cabin had something dark, something that didn't want anyone to discover it. And now, every time I'm alone in my apartment in the city, I can hear in the distance the slight creaking of wood, as if something is waiting. Even the familiar sounds of New York, the traffic, the neighbors, the hum of air conditioning, can't quite drown out that memory of mountain silence broken by whispers in the dark. I'm Hunter, and this is a story that still makes me shudder every time I remember it. A few years ago, my group of friends from college and I decided to escape the routine and spend a weekend at a cabin far from the city. It was the typical idea that sounded great at first: disconnect, forget about everyday problems, and enjoy nature without internet or worries. What none of us expected was that weekend would mark us for life. It all started when Manuel, one of the guys in our group, got hold of a cabin in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. It was on top of a hill surrounded by thick forest that seemed to have no end. The place was perfect for what we were looking for: remote, secluded, far from the hustle and bustle of our lives back in Little Rock. We agreed on the plan. We packed our backpacks with food, some craft beer from a local brewery, our camping gear, and everything we needed to enjoy a weekend of relaxation. The trip to the cabin was long. The road leading to it was deteriorated, and the landscape became increasingly wild and lonely as we left behind the familiar sights of Arkansas towns with their water towers and grain silos. At first, nobody complained. The excitement of adventure and anticipation kept us animated. We talked about everything: work, relationships, our plans after graduation, the latest Netflix series we'd been binge-watching. But as we got closer, something strange began to feel in the air. It wasn't fear, but a kind of subtle discomfort, as if nature itself was too quiet, too observant. We arrived just before sunset. The cabin was old, made of weathered pine logs, and seemed to have been there for decades. It had a rustic air, almost picturesque, but at the same time, something about its appearance made us feel uncomfortable. The windows, with dirty glass, reflected the last lights of the day in a strange way. Despite how picturesque it might seem, the place had a strange air, as if it had been uninhabited for a long time. The porch sagged slightly, and some of the shutters hung at odd angles. We quickly settled in and started preparing dinner. The fireplace crackled, and the sound of burning wood filled the cabin. We laughed, remembered old times from our days at the University of Arkansas, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. We cooked burgers on a portable grill, shared stories about our jobs and relationships, and felt like we were back to our carefree college days. However, as night fell and darkness closed over the forest, something began to change. The first hours were quiet, but when night settled completely, we began to hear strange noises. At first, we thought it could be the wind moving branches or some animal prowling near the cabin, but the noises became more intense. First, a soft tapping on the main door, as if someone was knocking gently but persistently. I thought it was one of the guys joking around, but when I opened the door, there was nothing. The darkness was so dense you couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. The Arkansas night was thick with humidity and the sound of cicadas. But there was something else, an unnatural silence underlying the normal forest sounds. The laughter started to diminish, and a feeling of discomfort began to invade us. We sat back by the fireplace, but the warmth of the fire didn't help calm the strange chill that ran through the cabin. It was then that we started to hear something else scratching, as if something was dragging across the wooden walls. At first, we tried to ignore it, attributing it to some animal outside or even the sound of the house settling with the cool night air. But what came next made us doubt our explanation. At one point, one of the guys, Jorge, got up and walked toward one of the windows. At first, he didn't say anything, but then he looked at us with wide eyes. "Does anyone else see that?" he asked, pointing outside. We approached the window and we all fell silent. Outside, among the darkness of the forest, figures could be distinguished moving among the trees. We couldn't see clearly, but it seemed like there was something or someone moving in the shadows, moving from side to side. They weren't animals and couldn't be reflections of the firelight, since they moved erratically and too human-like. The movements were deliberate, purposeful, as if whatever was out there was circling the cabin. Unease began to grow in all of us. We decided to close the windows and lower the blinds, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was heavier than before. We looked at each other without knowing what to think. Some tried to stay calm, but others, like Juan, began to talk about the possibility that the cabin was haunted, or that someone was playing with us from the forest. The Ozarks had always been full of local legend stories of settlers who disappeared, of strange lights in the woods, of things better left undisturbed. But I didn't believe in those things. I was the practical one, the engineering student who believed in logical explanations. Suddenly, a loud knock on the main door made us jump with fright. The sound was so abrupt and so close that we all went silent, listening carefully. None of us dared to go open the door. This time it was as if something or someone wanted to enter. The knocking had a rhythm to it, almost like a code, but not one any of us recognized. We decided to close the doors with the latches and make sure no opening was left through which something could slip. But when we started checking the locks, we realized something that paralyzed us. The doors, although they were closed from the inside, seemed to be sealed as if something had blocked them from the outside. We tried to open the windows, but they were all firmly closed. Even the chimney, through which we thought maybe we could escape if necessary, was sealed. The window latches were rusted, and despite our efforts, we couldn't move them even an inch. Fear became more real with each minute that passed. How was it possible that the doors were blocked from the inside? No one else had entered the cabin, and we all had the keys. The feeling of being trapped, of not being able to get out, began to take hold of us. We decided to split into groups and explore the cabin looking for some exit or some logical explanation. But all we found was more bewilderment. The walls had no additional windows. There were only a couple of rooms, and they were all sealed in the same way. Doors closed from the inside, windows with no possibility of opening, and the sound of scratching on the walls that didn't stop. Suddenly, someone screamed from upstairs. We ran up the stairs, and there we found Manuel staring fixedly at the window of his room. He was pale, almost breathless. "What did you see?" Laura asked with a trembling voice. Manuel didn't answer immediately. He just pointed outside. Outside, among the mist and darkness of the forest, we saw what looked like a human figure watching us through the window. It wasn't possible for it to be there. No one had climbed through that window, and much less had stayed looking inside. But there it was, an immobile shadow watching us in silence. The figure was tall, unnaturally still, and seemed to be wearing dark clothing that blended with the night. Suddenly, a loud and guttural noise, like something heavy falling, made us react. We all turned toward the hallway where the sound came from. Something or someone was inside the cabin, moving stealthily. Some froze while others tried to find an exit at all costs. But there was no way, there was nothing we could do. The feeling of being hunted, of being played with, was overwhelming. When fear reached its peak, the lights began to flicker, and a creaking echoed throughout the cabin. At that moment, as if the house itself was breathing, the doors that had been closed before began to move by themselves, slowly, as if something invisible was pushing them. The feeling of being trapped became even more unbearable, and finally one of us, with a scream of desperation, tried to open a window by force. It was then, when the doors opened completely, that we heard one last thing, a low, deep laugh coming from the hallway. Something or someone had been waiting for us, playing with us from the beginning. The laughter seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing through the cabin in a way that made it impossible to locate its source. And before we could understand what was happening, we threw ourselves outside, running toward the forest, away from the cabin, without looking back. The Arkansas woods were thick and disorienting, branches catching at our clothes, roots trying to trip us, but we kept running. When we managed to reach the town of Mountain View, we were all exhausted, our minds clouded by fear. Nobody said a word during the drive back to Little Rock. We knew that although we had escaped from the cabin, what we experienced that night would never leave us. The feeling of being trapped, the doors closed from the inside, the shadows in the windows, I still feel them. And although years have passed, we never approached that cabin again. I don't know what really happened that night, or who or what was there with us. But every time I think about it, the same feeling of terror and desperation returns, as if that laughter is still echoing in the air. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment in Little Rock, I find myself checking the locks on my doors and windows, remembering that night when locks meant nothing, when safety was just an illusion. The Ozark Mountains still call to me sometimes, but I never answer. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some laughter should never be heard again. My name is Chase. I'm 25 years old, and I work as a freelance editor. I often have to take on projects where concentration is key. So when I was offered the opportunity to spend a few days at a remote cabin in the Sierra Nevada mountains to work in peace, I didn't hesitate for a second. I had no immediate commitments, and the isolation seemed perfect for diving deep into work without distractions. Besides, being a place away from everything, the idea of disconnecting from daily routine attracted me a lot. I'd never been in such a remote area, and the idea of being surrounded by California wilderness seemed like something that, in addition to being necessary, would be fascinating. The cabin was located in a clearing in the middle of the forest, far from any town or busy highway. I was told it had been built many years ago by a man who no longer lived there, and that the place had been remodeled to accommodate occasional travelers. The owners, some family friends, assured me that the stay would be comfortable, with all the necessary facilities, and that the landscape would be breathtaking. Although I wasn't a great lover of the outdoors, the solitude and silence seemed like the perfect environment to work to my heart's content. I arrived in a rental car after an hour-and-a-half trip on rural roads that got narrower as I went deeper into the mountains. The last part of the journey was on a dirt path that could barely be called a road, but finally I reached the cabin. It was a simple wooden structure with a porch that looked out over a wide valley covered by a sea of pines and firs. Above, the mountains rose majestically, and fog was beginning to settle on the nearest peaks. The environment was impressive, but also somewhat disturbing, as if nature was watching. The first day was perfect. The sun was shining, the cabin had a small fireplace, and everything seemed to be in its place. I settled in, organized my things, and sat down to work. I spent the day writing, occasionally looking out the window, feeling how the solitude enveloped me in a way that, far from making me uncomfortable, I found comforting. The quietness of the place allowed me to concentrate better than anywhere else. The only sounds were the whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of a mountain jay. In the afternoon, after a couple of hours of work, I decided to take a short walk around the surroundings, explore a bit. I went outside walking among the trees, enjoying the freshness of the mountain air. There wasn't a soul in sight, just the whisper of wind among the branches and the occasional creaking of trees. For a couple of hours, I went deeper into the forest, taking my time to enjoy the landscape. The Sierra Nevada was more beautiful than I'd imagined. Massive granite formations, crystal clear streams, wildflowers blooming in hidden meadows. But the further I got from the cabin, the more I noticed something wasn't right. The feeling of being watched, although faintly, began to settle in my mind. It wasn't something tangible, but uneasiness began to run through me. A little later I realized I had lost the trail. I tried to remember the way back, but I wasn't clear about where I had come from. I thought there was nothing to worry about, that at some point I would find the way back, but the forest seemed much denser than I remembered. I began to feel somewhat uncomfortable. I wasn't lost, but I didn't want night to catch me in that place. I decided to return, but when I tried to find the path I had come by, I realized it had disappeared. The forest was becoming increasingly dark and fog was beginning to close over me. I started walking quickly, trying to stay calm, but then something stopped me cold. In the distance, among the trees, I saw a figure. It wasn't clear, I couldn't distinguish it well, but there was something in its posture that made me uncomfortable. It looked like a person, or rather the silhouette of someone standing still, watching me from a distance. I couldn't see details, but I knew it wasn't a tree or a natural shadow. The figure remained motionless, barely glimpsed among the shadows. A chill ran down my spine, and for a moment I didn't know what to do. Maybe it was someone who lived nearby, maybe another hiker. I decided to turn around and return to the cabin as quickly as possible. The feeling that I was being watched wouldn't leave me. While I walked at an accelerated pace, I heard the crackling of dry leaves behind me. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. Just trees, more trees, the same quietness. However, the sound continued, as if something or someone was following me at a distance. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I managed to find the trail back. I reached the cabin exhausted, with my pulse racing. I closed the door carefully and made sure the windows were well closed. It was hard for me to calm down, but once inside, the feeling of uneasiness began to fade. I decided not to think more about what I had seen, about that distant figure, and spent the rest of the night in the cabin, working a little more before sleeping. However, the next day the situation repeated itself. I spent the morning working peacefully, but in the afternoon, I again felt the need to go out and walk. This time, I decided to go in the opposite direction in case the previous trail had disoriented me. But when I walked for a couple of hours, something strange happened. I saw footprints on the ground. They weren't recent, but they were quite clear. They looked like human footprints, and for a moment I thought there was someone else nearby. The idea of finding someone in that isolated place relieved me, but at the same time, something made me uncomfortable. The footprints seemed to have been left there a couple of days ago, and there were no signs of recent life. That made me think that probably someone had been there a while ago, but in the back of my mind, uneasiness was returning. I decided to follow the trail, and after a while, the footprints led me to a small hill from where you could see the cabin in the distance. But what surprised me was that at the base of the hill, among the bushes, I found a small backpack. It wasn't lost, it seemed placed there intentionally. I opened it cautiously, and inside there were common objects: a water bottle, a flashlight, some food, but what surprised me most was a notebook. I took it and began to flip through it, thinking it might be from some past excursion, but what I read left me frozen. There were phrases written by hand, in a disorderly way, almost as if it had been written without clear order. Some said things like, "I'm close, I can't let him see me, I can't leave," and others more disturbing. "He sees me, he's looking." The words didn't make sense, but reading them, something inside me broke. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure I had seen the first day, about that presence in the forest. It was as if everything was connecting. I looked around, but didn't see anyone. However, the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone else was watching me, was now stronger than ever. I decided to return to the cabin, but this time I didn't go by the usual trail. I took a different path, as if trying to avoid any clue that could follow me. As I walked, I realized something even more disturbing. The path I had taken didn't match the map they had given me. The routes weren't traced as they were supposed to be. And worst of all was that looking around, I noticed something that chilled my blood. The footprints on the ground, the same footprints I had seen before, began to appear again, but this time much closer. The footprints didn't come from my direction, but toward it. Someone else had been following me all the time, and that feeling of being watched, that unmistakable fear, returned with overwhelming force. I finally decided to close all the cabin windows and wait without moving, without making noise. Uncertainty consumed me, and although I stayed awake all night, I never saw that person. I never knew who was behind all this. The next day, when sunlight finally entered through the windows, I hurried to pack my things. I didn't want to stay there one more minute. There were no clear signs that someone was nearby, but the feeling of being watched was so overwhelming that I could no longer bear it. I quickened my pace toward the car and quickly moved away from the cabin. I never knew who had been watching me or why, but one thing was clear: something or someone in that forest was waiting. When I returned to the city, I tried to leave that experience behind, but the footprints on the ground, the backpack, the words written in the notebook wouldn't leave me alone. Nobody believed me when I told them what I had experienced, but I know what I saw. And although the fear has passed, the feeling of being watched, of not being alone, has never completely abandoned me. Even now, working in my apartment in San Francisco, sometimes I find myself looking over my shoulder, checking the locks, wondering if something followed me home from those dark mountains. The Sierra Nevada calls to many people with its beauty and solitude, but I've learned that some solitude isn't really solitude at all. Sometimes, in the most remote places, you're never truly alone. And sometimes, that's the most terrifying thing of all. The way that stayed in my head until today isn't because of what happened, but because of the calm with which everything happened. Because it was calm, silent, as if it had been arranged beforehand. I'm Eduardo, I'm 41 years old, and I've been more than 15 years only in University Hospital. Today I teach, but I continue as a night shift doctor in the emergency room. I can't leave the ICU. Most who leave say it's because of stress, responsibility, the physical toll. But the truth is there are things there that affect us differently, and we don't always understand how. This case was in the clinical sector of the adult ICU. Old wing, but with everything working well. End of corridor, bed 14, restricted visits. Access only with authorization at reception. Long corridor, somewhat dark, always cold. I was on the night shift with reduced staff. It was one of those early mornings that seems like it will end before the sun rises, so dragged out. The patient was Mr. Robert, 63 years old, post-stroke complication. He had already entered what we call palliative care. The parameters had been dropping slowly in recent days, and that night we already had the protocols ready. The family knew. Nobody was expecting a miracle there anymore. But there was one detail. His brother, Paul, 60 years old, came every day. He arrived early, slept on the reception bench with an old backpack at his feet, pillow from home, lunch wrapped in plastic wrap. He never wanted to take turns with the children or nephews. He said his brother wouldn't be alone, not at the end. Everyone there knew who he was, and nobody removed him from there. The first time I talked to him, I thought he was some new technician. He was discreet, quiet, and had something in his look that bothered me. It seemed like he knew what was going to happen, just didn't accept it. Well, it was around 5:20 in the morning. I was finishing the shift records, already knowing that Mr. Robert wouldn't make it past that morning. The doctor had already told me. He was with a very low pattern, poor saturation, oscillating even with support, but everything was too quiet. There was no code, no alarm. I looked at the monitor, saw that there was no longer any response, and just went to confirm. We closed the protocol at 5:22. It was just me in the room because the doctor had already left to notify supervision. I stayed finishing filling out the system right there, leaning against the back counter, low light, room in absolute silence. And when I went to click on the last field of the medical record, I heard, behind me, very close, "Wait for his brother, they're going together." It wasn't a thought, it wasn't a sensation. It was a low voice, clear, as if there was someone beside me between the bed and the counter. I froze, turned immediately. There was nobody, not at the door, not in the corridor, no sign of footsteps, no sound of slippers dragging, nothing. I went to the corridor, took a quick look, empty. I returned to the room as if nothing had happened, but my whole body was alert. I was hearing everything at the same time. The beeping of another patient's oximeter, the respirator from bed 11, even a humming from the ceiling that I had never noticed. I finished the chart, left without commenting. The rational mind said it was fatigue. 24 hours of hospital, 2 critical patients in protocol, pressure from outside the wing. But that phrase kept playing as if it had been said just for me. 2 hours later, reception stopped. One of the assistants entered the ICU breathless, with her mask crooked and eyes wide. She could only say, "It's the brother." He fell from the chair. Paul, the man from reception, had woken up sitting on the same bench as always, with the same backpack at his feet, and fell forward. All at once, without warning, without making a sound. They tried to resuscitate. The protocol was complete. Emergency medical services activated, defibrillator, emergency room team coming in support. I followed from a distance because I couldn't get close. I had already understood what was happening. He didn't come back. The doctor wrote in the preliminary report, "Sudden cardiorespiratory arrest without prior complaint." He was up to date with exams, no known history, was fed, lucid. He had talked to reception at 4:50. There was no justification or explanation. When the family found out, it was contained despair, but nobody seemed truly surprised. There was a phrase that stayed in my head more than the voice I heard. It was from the youngest daughter of the two. She said with a calm voice, but firm. They always said this, that if one went, the other would follow. After that, I continued the shift automatically. The shift change had already happened, but I stayed there by protocol and being honest, because I didn't want to walk down that corridor alone. There was a strange silence in the sector. It wasn't the common silence of hospital early morning. It was another type, like what comes when there are things nobody wants to comment on. The whole team became more contained. The doctor didn't question anything, just did what needed to be done, with care that wasn't just professional. And bed 14 stayed with the curtain closed longer than normal. I left at the end of the morning, signed the book, returned my badge. At night, I passed directly by the reception where Paul always stayed and couldn't even look at the bench where he used to settle. That voice wouldn't stop coming back. It wasn't even what it said. It was the way, the security of the phrase. Wait for his brother, they're going together. It didn't seem like wishful thinking, didn't seem like desire. It was as if it was something already settled, just needed to be fulfilled. I avoided commenting with colleagues for a while, and maybe that was the biggest discomfort, because everything inside me said that needed to be said. But when you're in a technical environment like ours, anything that escapes the tangible becomes superstition. And I didn't want to seem unbalanced, much less someone who loses control when the shift gets tight. I only told months later in a conversation circle among veterans. And even there, with people who had already seen things that can't be explained, the silence that remained after I finished speaking was heavier than any opinion. Some shook their heads. Others just said they had heard similar things, but nobody found it absurd. Nobody laughed. And I wasn't the only one to avoid the sector after that. There was a technician who asked for transfer to the surgical block, a physical therapist who stopped doing night care. And I myself, until today, when I have to cover some leave in that wing, my step quickens when I get near bed 14. There's nothing there, just bed, panel, clean curtain. But the impression it gives is that someone is missing. Like there's someone who hasn't left the shift yet. Like someone is still waiting. They've asked me if I really heard that, or if it wasn't just fatigue, psychological pressure, shift weight. But there are things you don't forget, don't try to remember. You just keep in a corner and avoid getting close. Paul wasn't just a brother, he was Robert's shadow. He was that part that didn't want to let the other enter that endless corridor alone. The family held a joint wake, one beside the other, same day, same goodbye. And as heavy as that sounds, there was sense there. A strange fit, as if one was waiting to pull the other, as if it had to be that way and only that way. Today, I don't say I believe everything, but I also don't doubt anything anymore, because we might understand how the body works. We know what each device measures, what each index means, but there's no equipment that detects this type of bond. And when it manifests, it's not with noise, nor with alarm. It's just a phrase in a dark room said by someone you don't see, beside a bed where there was no longer anyone. The thing about working nights at Chicago General is that the hospital becomes a different place after midnight. The daytime bustle of doctors making rounds, families visiting, the constant hum of activity, all of that fades away. What's left is just the essential sounds. Ventilators breathing for patients who can't, monitors beeping their electronic lullabies, and the soft footsteps of night nurses moving through corridors, lit only by emergency lighting. I'd been working the night shift in the ICU for 8 years when Robert and Paul came into my life. Robert was a retired steelworker from the South Side, one of those tough Chicago guys who'd spent 40 years working the mills before a stroke landed him in our care. Paul was his younger brother, a carpenter who'd never married, never moved more than 5 miles from the house where they'd grown up together on Halsted Street. The first thing you noticed about Paul was his devotion. While other families rotated visits, took breaks, went home to shower and change clothes, Paul never left. He'd claimed that uncomfortable vinyl chair in the family waiting area like it was his personal territory. The night security guards knew him by name. The cafeteria staff saved him coffee even after official hours. And the cleaning crew worked around him like he was part of the furniture. They've been like this since they were kids, Robert's daughter Maria told me one evening. She was a teacher at one of the elementary schools in Pilsen, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who came by after work most days. Paul never had kids of his own, never really had anyone except Uncle Robert. When our dad got sick, Paul moved in to take care of him. That was 15 years ago. Maria paused, stirring cream into her coffee from the machine in the family lounge. Outside the windows, you could see the lights of the Willis Tower piercing the darkness, the city continuing its life, while we held vigil in this place between life and death. The weird thing is, she continued, Uncle Paul has this heart condition, has had it for years. The doctors keep telling him he needs to take it easy, reduce stress, but he won't leave Dad's side. Says they made a pact when they were young that neither one would face the end alone. I thought about that conversation a lot in the days that followed. There's something about lifelong bonds that transcends what we understand medically. I'd seen it before, elderly couples who died within days of each other, mothers who seemed to will themselves to stay alive until their children could say goodbye. But Robert and Paul were different. Their connection felt almost supernatural in its intensity. The night everything changed, I was working with a skeleton crew. Dr. Martinez was covering the ICU along with the emergency department, and we had only 2 nurses for 12 patients. It was one of those October nights when the wind off Lake Michigan rattles the windows and makes the whole building creak like an old ship. Robert's condition had been deteriorating steadily. His chart showed the textbook progression of someone whose body was shutting down systems one by one. We'd had the family meeting, signed the DNR orders, prepared everyone for what was coming. But somehow Robert kept hanging on day after day, as if waiting for something. I was updating his medication chart when I heard it. Not a whisper, not a thought, but a clear voice speaking directly behind me. Wait for his brother. They're going together. The voice was so clear, so matter-of-fact, that I actually turned around expecting to see Dr. Martinez or one of the other nurses. But I was alone in the room with Robert's unconscious form. The corridor outside was empty, lit only by the dim emergency lighting that made everything look like an old black and white movie. My hands were shaking as I finished the chart. 24 hours of hospital coffee and stress, I told myself. Hallucinations from exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The voice had been too clear, too specific. And there was something about the tone, a certainty that made my skin crawl. 2 hours later, the call came from reception. Paul had collapsed in the waiting area. By the time the crash team reached him, he was already gone. Massive heart attack, probably instantaneous. The same heart condition that had been a concern for years had finally claimed him. But the timing felt like more than coincidence. I stood in the doorway of Robert's room, watching the monitors that showed his vitals gradually declining. No alarms, no emergency codes, just a gentle settling as his body finally allowed itself to let go. The time of death on both charts would be separated by less than 3 hours. The funeral was held at St. Alphonsus on the north side, the same church where both brothers had been baptized 70 years earlier. The priest spoke about bonds that transcend death, about love that endures beyond the physical world. But sitting in that pew, listening to the organ music echo off the stained glass windows, I kept thinking about that voice in the dark hospital room. In the weeks that followed, other staff members began sharing their own stories about Bed 14. The day shift nurse mentioned cold spots that couldn't be explained by the building's ventilation system. A respiratory therapist swore she'd seen 2 figures standing at the foot of the bed during her rounds, though when she looked directly, there was nothing there. The hospital administration eventually had the room blessed by a chaplain, though they never put anything official in writing. Bed 14 continued to house patients, but the staff avoided working alone in there when possible. Not because we were afraid, exactly, but because some places hold onto memories in ways that make the living uncomfortable. I transferred to the day shift 6 months later, officially for family reasons, though the truth was more complicated. There are some things you can't unhear, some voices that echo in your memory long after the words have faded. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I'm driving past Chicago General on my way home, I'll look up at the 4th floor windows and wonder if someone is still waiting, still watching over the patients who occupy Bed 14. Because the thing about bonds like Robert and Paul's is that they don't always respect the boundaries between life and death. Some connections run deeper than medicine can measure, stronger than any monitor can detect. And sometimes, if you're very quiet and very still, you might hear the echo of promises made long ago, in the voices of those who refuse to leave their loved ones behind. It's not something I usually talk about, but it's been over a year now, and I still find myself reviewing the files from that day, as if I missed something I should have caught, or as if I wished I had missed it. I'm a forensic pathologist, been working for 10 years at the morgue of University Medical Center in Phoenix. And what happened occurred right inside the reconstruction room, where we do the final closure of bodies after internal examinations. It's the last procedure before release to the funeral home. It was late afternoon. The room was already cold, clean, and the body on the table belonged to a man in his mid-40s, well preserved. It had been a simple case, practically straightforward report, accident victim, no external marks, nothing suspicious, clean body already emptied, prepared for suturing. I was alone at that moment. My assistant had gone to fetch a tray that was left in the refrigerator, and the radiology team had already finished their part earlier. I picked up the larger needle, began the first stitch in the thoracic cavity, which is where we suture the chest opening to reconstruct the body's integrity. Standard movement. Pull the nylon thread, pierce through the muscle tissue, adjust the tension, continue the line. On the third pass, I felt a snap. It wasn't exactly a loud sound. It was muffled, more internal. At first, I thought it might be residual gas, which isn't common after so much time but can happen. But the moment I pulled the line again, there came a click, a dry sound, small, like a plastic button activating something. And then something happened that shouldn't happen there, at least not in that way. From inside, the cavity began to emerge a low sound, digital, a recording, a muffled male voice, almost as if there were fabric over it. It said just this: "Now it's your turn." It stopped, lasted 2 seconds, maybe not even that, but it came from inside the chest. I stood frozen, with my hand holding the thread in midair, as if I had pulled something beyond just tissue. There was no device, no metallic object, nothing embedded, nothing visible. I undid the stitch immediately, opened the cavity again more carefully. I touched each rib with the forceps, each muscle edge, turned the body slightly to the side, looked behind the sternum, looked behind the diaphragm. Nothing. I went to the tray, grabbed the morning's x-ray, no foreign body. I took my phone, went to the technician's room and requested a new radiograph, just as a precaution. They did it. The image came back clean. No chip, no recorder, no inserted object. I requested an MRI. The department complied with protocol. Normal result, tissue, bone, air, nothing more. I stayed silent until then. Didn't comment to anyone because nobody would believe it, or worse, they'd start looking for explanations I didn't want to hear. But when I went to review the file, one detail bothered me even more. In the reconstruction room, we have a recorder. It's fixed in the upper corner, next to the registration camera. It serves to record any observation that needs to be noted in audio. It stays in continuous recording, but the files are separated into 5-minute blocks. I accessed the files, went to the exact time between 5:23 and 5:28 p.m. I just wanted to check if that was only in my head. The audio exists, but it's too short. It starts with the sound of the tray, the scraping of the stool, and then comes a sound that if you know it, you know what it is. The click of nylon being tensioned. And then the same voice, the same phrase, but without echo, without the muffled sound of the room. The pure voice. "Now it's your turn," then silence. I stood there for several minutes, just listening again and again. On the 7th time, I had to pause because something new entered. Someone knocked on the door. It was the hospital's sound technician, a guy who shouldn't even be there. He came in to take some borrowed equipment, saw the interface open on my monitor, and asked if he could listen to the clip. I said there was nothing much, just noise, but he listened and went pale. He said with a slightly trembling voice, "That voice is my brother's, just that." Didn't want to listen again, didn't ask anything, left the room, and never touched on the subject again. The next day, the audio was no longer in the system, just the file name and a removal notice due to code error. But I still have the time saved, and every time I pull thread on a body, that phrase comes back to me like a personal reminder. Now it's your turn. After that day, it took me a while to be able to suture with tranquility again. Not exactly from fear, but because something in the gesture had changed. Suturing had always been mechanical for me. Pierce, pull, tighten. But now, every time the thread slides through the muscle tissue, I hear the sound again. Not for real, not environmental, just inside my head, just at the exact point when I apply tension. I ended up doing something I shouldn't have. I took the audio with me, saved the clip on a hidden flash drive, the cleanest version I could get from the system before it disappeared. I showed it to 2 colleagues from forensics without giving context. I said it was from an old investigation, misidentified file. Both listened. Neither recognized the voice, but one of them asked something I still think about today. "Are you sure this was said to whoever was listening or to whoever was suturing?" That locked me up inside, because until then I was assuming the sound was directed at me. But when you listen with the thought that the phrase was said to someone who came before, the thing changes tone. Now it's your turn. It could be about whoever touches the body, but it could also be about whoever passes it forward, about whoever delivers, about whoever closes. And then that becomes more than a sound, it becomes a type of passage, of warning, or worse, of delegation. I spent weeks in silence, but my head wouldn't let go. So I went back to pull the complete file of the man who was on the table. I went after his hospital entry, history, personal belongings. Nothing. No recent entry, no previous surgery, no electronic implant. Just a wallet, a cheap watch, and a simple chain. He didn't even carry a phone. But then, on a quick visit to the imaging department, I crossed paths with the same sound technician, the one whose brother's voice was in the audio. He called me aside and said he needed to talk. We went down to the parking garage. He leaned against the car, looked down, and said, "Out of nowhere, my brother took his own life." Just like that, without beating around the bush. I stayed quiet. He continued. It was with a recording he left an audio, but not for me, for another person. I only heard it later. I asked almost without meaning to, "Do you remember what it said?" He nodded slowly. "The same thing, word for word, the same phrase you showed me." After that, he got in the car and drove away, and never came back to the hospital. To this day, I don't know his brother's name, or if the story matches any record, but from time to time, some body comes to the table and gives me a similar feeling. There's no sound, no snap, no audio, but there's that loaded silence, as if something had already been said, and I had arrived just to close the package. In our routine, the body is always the last step, but since that day, I stopped believing that. Reconstruction became the heaviest part for me, not because of the technique, but because of the possibility. Because if a single phrase managed to come out without any device, without any auditory channel, without even being recorded in me, then what else could be waiting to come out? And when? How far does what a body holds go? And how far does our function of closing go? even without understanding what we're locking inside. We learn to do what needs to be done, even on the heaviest days. You can't get attached to any patient when you work in palliative care. It's like our care only serves to guarantee a dignified end, or at least one without pain. But every now and then someone comes in who crosses that line and leaves a mark where they shouldn't. His name was Genesis, Mr. Genesis, as we called him. He came transferred from the clinical sector with already compromised kidney function and no neurological response. His condition was so stable in its severity that honestly, we didn't even keep going to check on him every hour like we would with someone at risk of sudden deterioration. He was already on the other side, you know. Only his body insisted on staying. He stayed 4 days like this, breathing with support, without reaction, without movement, just with those little half-closed eyes. And it wasn't even sleep, it was that emptiness we recognize immediately. His daughter came every day, sat beside him, caressed his arm. Sometimes she read a letter, put perfume on his shirt collar, adjusted the blanket, as if that would change anything. The granddaughter, a girl of about 20-something years, also came sometimes, more in the late afternoon. She stayed quietly, just watching. It was peaceful to see that, but it also squeezed inside, because it seemed like she was preparing to deal with an absence before it happened. The wing where I work has a strange echo. Everything is white, the lights are cold, and at dawn, even with people hospitalized, it seems like only we exist inside there. And on that afternoon of the 5th day, bed 6, which was always silence, moved. I was inside there, organizing another patient's wires, when I heard the monitor sound change. At first I thought it was cable failure, but I turned and saw the impossible. He was awake, eyes truly open, not half-closed, not lost, open, focused, breathing better and on his own. He slowly brought his hand to his chest, adjusted the sheet, and turned his face toward the door. I'm not one to get scared easily, no, but I froze. It was as if he had returned from nothing. It wasn't a spasm or reflex, it was presence, it was himself. I called the doctor on duty, who was also confused, but noted everything. Saturation was good, heartbeats within expected. He wrote something I had never read in a medical record. Sudden clinical improvement, without justification, within the prognosis. It was as if the body had received a command we don't understand. They called the family, and it was the first time I saw people running to the ICU with joy on their faces. When they arrived, I gave them space. I stayed further back observing. The old man smiled, seriously. A real smile, somewhat weak, but it was there. He looked directly at the granddaughter, then at the daughter, squeezed both their hands, kissed the older woman's hand. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, I don't know how to explain. They didn't look like someone who had returned. They looked like someone who knew he was going, but wanted to say something first. The daughter started crying immediately. The granddaughter tried to hold back, but her mouth trembled. The doctor who entered later thought it better to maintain care, but already warned. Let's observe. But his base condition hasn't changed. He just had a reaction. I stayed there the whole time, and I'll tell you, it was one of the most difficult moments I've ever seen in that wing, because we don't expect someone to come back, and much less with such serenity. He stayed well for about 2 hours, dozed afterward. Slow breathing, calm monitor, everything normal. A beautiful silence, if such a thing exists. The daughter left to eat something. The granddaughter went with her. I stayed nearby checking the data, noting in the system. When I returned to look at the monitor, it was zeroed, and it wasn't a shock. It wasn't an emergency. It was as if the body had just stopped. But at that moment, nobody despaired, didn't call code blue, didn't try to reverse. The doctor just looked and said, he had already gone, just came back to close the cycle. And I never managed to forget that late afternoon, because the difficult thing wasn't seeing him leave. It was seeing him come back, knowing it would only be for an instant. The next day, the bed was vacated before normal time. The daughter asked that they not touch anything until she returned with the clothes he most liked to wear. A wine sweater, quite old, that according to her was visiting clothes. I found that beautiful. It was as if she knew he had gone to visit someone before resting for good. I helped arrange everything, fold the sheets, clean the space, but none of the girls looked at me the same as that late afternoon. There was something in the way they looked at me, as if I had witnessed something that only the family should have seen. The granddaughter stood beside the now empty bed, playing with the bracelet he had given her when she was small, and then spoke quietly, almost without moving her mouth. He was waiting for me. She said this looking at the already empty sheet, and I couldn't answer. I just nodded as if I understood, but until today, I don't know if I understood. In the following weeks, they commented a lot about the case behind the scenes. Of course, without fanfare, nobody talks about these things in the medical record, but you notice in the whispers, in the way others look at bed 6, as if it wasn't just another number. A newer nurse even asked kind of jokingly, nervously, "Martha, do you think he knew?" And I said what I really think. He didn't come back by miracle, nor by improvement. He came back for love. And for me, that's what makes everything more difficult, because we prepare for the end, get used to turning off machines, with the sheet covering up to the shoulders, with the continuous sound of the monitor. But nobody prepares us for when someone comes back, just to say goodbye. His body had no structural alteration. No exam justified the improvement. There was no new medication, no machine adjustment, no unexpected immune reaction. It was just him, as if something inside him had made an effort just to be there for a few more hours. The daughter came back after a week. She left a little note at the nursing station. It said, "Thank you for not doubting him. He knew there wasn't time anymore, but still insisted on staying a little longer." I kept that paper until today. It's folded at the bottom of my scrubs drawer, not out of attachment, but because there are things you can't explain or forget. And every time I pass in front of bed 6 with another patient, another case, another medical record, I remember that late afternoon, that smile, and I'm left with the feeling that he had already gone, yes, but that he came back just to leave no doubt, so nobody would carry emptiness, and maybe, just maybe, to teach us that not everything ends when it seems to have finished. The palliative care ward at Houston Methodist Hospital has a different quality of light than the rest of the building. Maybe it's the way the afternoon sun filters through the tall windows facing the medical center. Or maybe it's something less tangible. But there's a softness there that seems intentional, designed to ease transitions that can't be hurried or forced. I'd been working in palliative care for 12 years when Genesis Williams arrived. He was 78 years old, a retired longshoreman from the 5th Ward who'd spent his life loading and unloading ships at the port of Houston. His hands, even in their weakened state, still bore the calluses of 40 years of hard labor, and his arms were covered with tattoos that told the story of a life lived fully. Anchors and roses, the names of sweethearts, dates that marked important moments in a world that no longer existed. Genesis had been living with his daughter Denise since his wife passed 3 years earlier. Denise was a social worker at Texas Children's Hospital, a woman in her 50s who understood the medical system better than most families we dealt with. But understanding the system and being emotionally prepared for what was happening to her father were two very different things. He raised me by himself after my mother left when I was 8. Denise told me during one of those long afternoons when families keep vigil beside beds, where their loved ones hover between worlds. He worked double shifts to pay for my college, never missed a parent-teacher conference, walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Now I have to watch him leave, and I don't know how to let go. Denise's daughter, Keisha, was 24 and fresh out of graduate school at Rice University with a degree in urban planning. She had her grandfather's eyes and her mother's determination. But there was something fragile about the way she sat beside Genesis's bed, as if she was trying to memorize everything about him before it was too late. Grandpa always said he'd see me graduate, Keisha told me one evening, as the lights of Houston's skyline began to twinkle outside the windows. He made it to the ceremony in May, even though he was already getting sick. He sat in that wheelchair in the front row and cheered louder than anyone when they called my name. Genesis had been unconscious for 4 days when it happened. His kidneys had failed, his neurological responses were minimal, and his breathing was entirely dependent on the ventilator. We'd had the family meetings, discussed comfort care, prepared everyone for what seemed inevitable. The monitors showed brain activity so minimal it barely registered, and his body temperature had been dropping steadily. I was adjusting his IV lines that Tuesday afternoon when I felt the change before I saw it. Sometimes you develop an intuition about these things, a sense of when the energy in a room shifts. I looked up from the IV pump to find Genesis's eyes open, not the half-lidded, vacant stare we'd grown accustomed to, but clear, focused, aware. He was breathing on his own. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that for a moment I wondered if I'd walked into the wrong room. Genesis turned his head toward me, tracked my movement as I reached for the call button, and then did something that made my heart skip. He smiled. Dr. Sarah Kim arrived within minutes, followed by the respiratory therapist and half the nursing staff on the floor. Genesis's vital signs had stabilized at levels we hadn't seen since his admission. His oxygen saturation was normal, his blood pressure was within acceptable ranges, and when Dr. Kim tested his reflexes, he responded appropriately to every stimulus. "This doesn't make medical sense," Dr. Kim said quietly as we huddled outside his room. "His kidney function hasn't improved. The brain scans from yesterday showed minimal activity, and his overall prognosis hasn't changed. But somehow, he's awake and responsive." When Denise and Keisha arrived, the reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. Genesis was weak, couldn't speak much because of the breathing tube, but his eyes followed their every movement. He reached for Keisha's hand, held it with surprising strength, and mouthed words that only she seemed to understand. "He's saying he's proud of me," Keisha translated, tears streaming down her face. He's saying he waited to see me one more time. For 2 hours, Genesis was fully present. He listened as Denise told him about her work, laughed silently when Keisha showed him photos on her phone from her new job in Austin. He touched Denise's face with trembling fingers, traced the outline of Keisha's graduation ring, and seemed to be studying them as if he was storing these images somewhere safe. But we all knew this was temporary. Dr. Kim had been clear about that. Whatever had brought Genesis back was likely his body's final effort, a brief rally before the inevitable decline. And sure enough, as the afternoon wore on, his eyes grew heavy again, his responses slower. Denise and Keisha stepped out to call family members, to share the miracle of these unexpected hours. I stayed with Genesis, monitoring his vitals as they gradually began to decline again. When I looked up from the chart I was updating, his eyes were on me, clear and grateful. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible even though we'd removed the breathing tube. Tell them it was time." Genesis closed his eyes then, and within minutes, his heart rhythm changed from the steady pattern we'd been monitoring to the irregular, slowing beat that meant the end was near. When Denise and Keisha returned, they found me holding his hand, watching the monitors as Genesis's body finally allowed itself to rest. There was no panic, no desperate attempts at resuscitation. We'd all understood that this brief return was a gift, not a reprieve. Denise held his other hand while Keisha stroked his forehead. And together, they whispered their love and their goodbyes, as Genesis Williams finally let go of the world he'd been holding onto for their sake. The next day, when I came to work, Bed 6 had been cleaned and prepared for the next patient. But Denise had left something on the nightstand, a small framed photo of Genesis in his longshoreman's uniform, standing beside a massive cargo ship at the port. He looked young and strong and proud, ready to take on whatever the world might throw at him. I kept that photo in our staff break room for months afterward, not because hospital policy allowed it, but because some people leave marks that transcend regulations. And every time I looked at it, I was reminded that love is sometimes strong enough to call someone back from the edge of eternity, if only for long enough to say the words that matter most. Genesis had waited to say goodbye properly, to look into the eyes of the people who mattered most to him, to leave them with the certainty that his love would outlast his physical presence. In 12 years of palliative care, I'd learned that death rarely follows the timeline we expect. But I'd never seen anything quite like Genesis's final gift to his family. Sometimes the greatest mercy we can offer isn't avoiding death, but allowing it to happen with dignity, surrounded by love, with enough time for the words that need to be spoken. Genesis taught me that the dying process isn't always about letting go. Sometimes it's about holding on just long enough to complete what love requires of us, even when our bodies have reached their limits. The last entry in Genesis's chart simply read, "Patient expired peacefully at 1847, surrounded by family." But charts can't capture the weight of a grandfather's final blessing, the way love can briefly triumph over biology, or the profound quiet that settles over a room when someone has finished their work in this world and is finally ready to rest. It's been 6 years and I don't enter neighborhoods with narrow streets anymore. I don't maneuver trucks around children, and I never sleep leaning against the driver's seat. Everything is marked. There's no image, no sound, no memory that erases what happened that morning. It was supposed to be a normal delivery, a commercial street in a suburb of a small town in Arizona. Those streets full of noise, full of life. The sound of pots clanging, kids running, neighbors shouting. "Hey Maria, bring in the laundry before it rains." And there in the middle, my truck, almost the size of the street. I always arrived slowly, turned off the radio, watched the corner of my eye in the rearview mirror because I knew there were kids everywhere, playing with tires, throwing balls, climbing on the back. It was normal. It never bothered me, no. I even thought it was beautiful, life, children running. It reminded me of my childhood in the countryside, which was too short. But that week there was one boy who was different. He wasn't like the others, you know. He stood still, didn't play, didn't say anything, just looked at me through the side mirror. Every time I backed up or stopped under the big tree, there was this skinny boy, messy hair, deep eyes, must have been about 6 or 7 years old, always in flip-flops and a baggy t-shirt. But what really caught my attention was the way he looked at me. It was a direct look. It wasn't curiosity. It was as if he was asking for something, as if I had to see him. I remember the last time well. He stood on the left side of the truck, right in the blind spot. He stared at me through the mirror, and I remember it like it was now. His eyes were watery, but he wasn't crying. The delivery was made early. 7 in the morning, I was already there. The guy from the warehouse helped me unload the propane tanks. It wasn't much. The problem was when it was time to leave. A resident's car was blocking the street. I had to reverse, and that's when it all started. I turned on the blinker, light honked slowly, looked both ways in the mirror, didn't see anyone. I repeat, I didn't see anyone. I released the brake, started backing up very slowly. That's when the sound came, a dry crack. It wasn't a tire, it wasn't anything loose. It was a sound the body doesn't forget. I hit the brake right away, opened the door on impulse. I jumped out of the truck with my heart racing, but nobody screamed. There was no scream, there was silence. A silence that breaks me just to remember. Then, from the corner of the sidewalk, came the muffled crying of a woman. When I looked behind the truck, I saw the scene that will go with me to the end of my life. It was him, the boy, fallen, without strength, his little arm still stretched out holding the side step of the truck. He had climbed on the metal while I was backing up, like so many boys do, like I've seen them do 1,000 times. But that time I didn't see. The street went into shock. The neighbors came running with their hands over their mouths. The man from the warehouse fell to his knees. The mother came later. She didn't scream. She just looked, and it was that look that destroyed me. People came, many. They called for help, police, ambulance. I stood there, unable to say anything. The camera from the tire shop next door caught everything. They showed me later. The boy appears running, leans against the truck, climbs on the side step, stands there looking at the cab, almost as if he expected me to notice him. But I didn't notice. The street was clear. I swear there was nobody when I looked, but the camera, it shows him. The mother came to me in the late afternoon. She didn't speak loudly, didn't hit me, wasn't crying anymore. She just asked, "You saw him yesterday, didn't you?" The question came cold. Yes, I saw him. I saw him standing in the corner of the street, looking at me through the mirror. And at that moment, I understood that he wasn't supposed to be there, but he was asking for someone to see him, and I saw him, but I didn't do anything. After that day, I could never look at a side mirror the same way again. I could never trust silence again, because it was in silence that everything happened. The mother didn't blame me with words, but her look, that look still lives with me. It was a tired look, as if she already knew it was going to happen, as if it wasn't even a surprise. It was just accumulated sadness. I wanted to say it had been an accident, that it was impossible to see, that he shouldn't have climbed up, but I didn't say anything, because deep down those words are useless. A child's mother doesn't want to hear explanations. She just wants her child back. After that day, I stopped making deliveries in urban areas. I only accepted highway routes, freeways, big cities with maneuvering yards. No neighborhoods with alleys, no streets where children play ball. And even so, the noise continues with me, that dry sound. I've tried everything to get it out of my head. Sleep with sound on, walk with company, do therapy. But it doesn't go away. I dreamed about him several times. In the dreams, he doesn't say anything, just climbs the steps slowly and looks at me. Sometimes I dream that the truck is stopped and I'm in there, and he appears next to the window as if asking me to see him, and I see myself trapped, unable to open the door. There are nights I wake up gasping with my hands shaking, with the sheets soaked in sweat, and I stare at the ceiling, remembering what the mother said. "You saw him yesterday, didn't you?" I saw him and did nothing. There were people who defended me. Road colleagues said it was absurd, that the boy shouldn't have been there, that the mother should have been careful. But that kind of defense doesn't help, because guilt isn't a matter of logic. It's something that grabs onto you and never lets go. I went to the mother's house some time later, brought some flowers, clapped at the door. She opened it, didn't smile, didn't send me away, didn't invite me in. She stood there, looked at me and said, "He liked the truck. He said he wanted to be like you." That broke me. It broke me inside. I stood there with the flowers in my hand. I wanted to ask for forgiveness, but I didn't know how. She just lowered her eyes and said very quietly, "We think we'll have time, don't we?" Since then, I never park near groups of children, not at schools, not at playgrounds. If I see a boy running on the sidewalk, I stop. Even if it delays everything, even if they honk behind me, I stop, because I know what it's like to carry a silence that won't go away. There was one night I stopped at a gas station around Tucson. I lay down on the back seat of the cab, with the window open and the desert heat coming in. I closed my eyes, and I swear by everything that's sacred. I felt the truck rock slightly, lightly, as if someone had climbed on the step. I opened my eyes startled, but there was nobody. I got out, walked around the truck, nothing. But the rearview mirror was crooked inward, as if someone had leaned against it. Maybe it was the wind, maybe not. But that made me think of something I've carried with me since that day. Sometimes we don't see, not because we don't want to, but because the world is too fast. And those who need help almost never speak. Today I'm a different man, quieter, slower. I carry a picture of him in the bottom of my wallet. It's not an official photo, it's a drawing his sister made. It's crooked, badly painted, but it's him. She gave it to me saying he was already a driver. And every time I sit in the cab, I put that drawing on the dashboard, not as a tribute, but as a reminder. A reminder that even the smallest step can change everything. And I know that maybe you who are listening to this now don't understand why I came here to tell it. But I needed to, because the worst thing isn't the sound of the accident. It's the silence after it. The wooden floor creaked even with the wind still, but that wasn't what bothered me. What left me with that thing stuck until today was the way things there seemed to have already happened, as if I hadn't been the first to stop with the truck at that house, nor would I be the last. It was at the end of September, on a stretch of old road between Amarillo and Lubbock in the Texas countryside. I was coming from Abilene, hauling empty propane cylinders, and the engine had been giving signs since early afternoon. I decided not to force it because in that region when it gets dark, it's real darkness that takes over. And I had already learned the hard way that you don't insist with stubborn roads. I saw a dirt driveway surrounded by low crops. It looked like corn or beans already dried. It wasn't a new farm. In the back of the land, a white house with a very low roof and a narrow porch. I thought I could pull over there and wait for the next day. Before honking or getting out, an old thin man appeared, long-sleeved shirt, despite the heat, walking slowly from the side of the house. He just made a gesture with his hand, like saying, "Come on," and disappeared inside. I pulled over calmly, grateful. 2 minutes later, he came back, this time with another man beside him, even older, dragging a leather sandal with the heel hanging out. They offered me water and asked if I needed help with the truck. I said no, that I just wanted to spend the night, and tomorrow morning I'd call a mechanic from the neighboring town. They nodded, and that was it. No excessive conversation. On the porch there were 3 wooden chairs, those that look handmade, with wide backs and long arms. They were clean, with the legs arranged perfectly on the floor, as if someone had just gotten up from them. But the 2 men, the owners of the house, didn't use them. One stood and the other pulled a low, 3-legged stool. I found it strange. At dinner time, a 3rd brother appeared, quieter than the others. He just looked at me, took a plate and sat on the floor beside the wall. The food was simple, boiled cassava and eggs. Nobody talked more than necessary, just a question or 2 about the road. And that was it. While I ate, I couldn't stop looking at the chairs. They remained there empty, one beside the other, as if they were waiting for something. It was almost without thinking. After I helped wash the dishes, I stretched on the porch and approached the first chair. I didn't get to sit or lean, but it was as if I had turned on an invisible alarm. One of the old men stepped forward very calmly, said, "That chair has its time, son. Better not." I stopped immediately. I felt the message. I went back to the truck, arranged a blanket on the seat, closed the doors with just a crack for air, and stayed there trying to sleep. It took a while. The silence of the countryside is another type of noise. We think it's good until we need it to calm down. I don't remember the time well, but it was in the middle of the night that I woke up. There was no light on, just a moonlight crossing through the roof beams. And that's when I saw it. One of the chairs was rocking slowly. There was no wind. The leaves of the plant near the door frame were still, and even so the chair went back and forth in the rhythm of a mute conversation. I thought about getting out. I thought about it, but my body stayed where it was. The wood of the chair made a dry, short sound, and with each creak it seemed like time stretched a little more. When it stopped, it was worse, because what came after was a small whisper, as if someone was talking into another person's ear, very close. You couldn't understand what it said, but it was a voice there outside, in the middle of the night. I closed my eyes tight and only opened them again when the sun had already started to appear. When I got out of the truck, the 3 brothers were sweeping the yard. They pretended nothing happened. One of them brought me coffee in an old cup without a handle and just said, "Today is a hot day. Better solve things early." I drank the coffee, thanked them, and stayed there a few minutes looking at the porch. The chairs were still, but turned, all three at different angles, as if someone had just gotten up from them. On the second night, I didn't try to sleep early. That thing with the chair was still with me, not as a scare, but as weight. It didn't seem to have been to frighten me. It seemed like a warning, an old message, one of those that nobody writes, just lives. I spent the day near the truck fixing what I could. I called a guy from town who did maintenance. He showed up after lunch, fixed some parts, and recommended I sleep one more night as a precaution. The brothers heard and just nodded, as if they already knew I wouldn't leave that day. They didn't insist on conversation, didn't offer anything, just continued with their routine. Cleaning, yard work, simple food, and little eye contact. At dinner, I noticed something. All three sat on the floor, but with their backs to the chairs, as if turning to them was disrespectful or fearful. I don't know. I just know I noticed and did the same. Sleep, I didn't sleep. I lay on the truck seat with my eyes to the ceiling, listening to what seemed like nothing. But then it came. First, it was a dry crack, like when wood splits slowly. Then, a very light dragging, as if someone in sandals was walking slowly across the porch. I thought about opening the door. I thought about it, but something in me froze, not from terror, but from understanding. That wasn't to be confronted, it was to be respected. I stayed quiet, and then I heard the sound of a body sitting down. The wood gave way, then another, one more, 3. I counted, 3 weights descended. The truck seat trembled under my body, not from the sound, but from what that sound carried, as if the whole house breathed through those chairs. There were no steps, no talk, just presence. When day started to break very early, the brothers were already sweeping again. On the porch, the chairs were empty, but this time there was dust under 2 of them, as if they had been dragged forward and back to place. They didn't say anything, and neither did I. I went to start the truck, and one of them, the one who had been the first to wave 2 days before, approached calmly. With that same way you only see in those who have seen too much. He said just this: "If you ever come back, son, park the truck, but don't sit, not even out of habit." They remember who sat. I didn't look back, didn't honk, didn't thank, didn't need to. I took the road with a knot in my throat, as if I had left something there, a part of me that almost sat. And to this day, when I see a house with chairs on the porch, I look twice, not at the furniture, but to know who's respecting and who's going to forget to respect. Because empty chairs in old houses sometimes aren't an invitation, they're a warning. And warnings given in that land don't get repeated. Years later, I was hauling furniture through that same region and stopped at a truck stop about 20 miles from that farm. An old trucker was having coffee at the next table, local guy by his accent. I mentioned the area, described the house with the white porch and 3 chairs. His face changed. He set down his cup and said, "You talking about the Hendricks place? That family's been there since the 1800s, lost 3 sons in a mine accident back in 1922. All 3 were sitting on that porch when the news came." He paused, stirred his coffee. "Folks say they never left." I didn't ask more questions. Some stories explain themselves, but what he said next stayed with me. Those chairs been empty for near a century, but every now and then someone tries to sit. Never goes well for them. The chairs remember, and the dead don't like strangers in their place. I finished my coffee in silence and got back on the road. But now I understood why the brothers slept on the floor, why they swept around the chairs but never moved them, why they warned me with such calm certainty. They weren't the owners of that house. They were the caretakers, keeping watch over seats that belonged to the dead. And that's why, to this day, when I see an empty chair that looks too comfortable, too perfectly placed, too much like it's waiting, I remember those three brothers and their quiet respect for things that should stay undisturbed. Because some furniture isn't meant for the living, and some invitations are warnings in disguise. It was one of those Nevada days when the heat sticks your clothes to your back before you even finish starting the truck. I had made 2 early deliveries that day, nothing major, and was already thinking about lunch when a guy knocked on the cab door. Well-dressed, calm, with that manner of someone who already knew what he was coming to ask for. He wasn't known to me, but he seemed to know I was one of the few with a refrigerated truck in the region. He explained directly. He needed to transport an already sealed coffin from a chapel in town to the municipal cemetery, about 5 or 6 miles away. He said it was simple work, quick, that payment would be in cash and up front, just to ensure nobody would back out halfway through. The way he said, "already sealed," marked me, not because of the word, but because of the emphasis, as if that would convince me more than alert me. I accepted, of course. It was a job like any other and better paid than average. They gave me the time and said for me to just pull the truck up to the side door of the chapel, without honking, without hurry, that the people would already be waiting for me with the coffin ready. At the scheduled time, I arrived. About 5 men were waiting for me, all older, simple formal clothes, low gaze, without conversation. 2 of them entered the truck bed with me to help position the coffin. It was heavy, but was placed with all care, secured with straps, leaning against the left corner. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no prayer or farewell, no women, no children nearby. Too much silence for what you usually see at a send-off. That gave me the first chill, because silence at a wake only happens when the family wants to forget what happened. I got in the cab, adjusted the mirrors, and took the dirt road that led to the cemetery. Packed dirt, sun cracking the windshield, and dry woods on both sides. It was there in the first mile that I heard it. I thought it was something from the truck bed, wood moving, some loose strap. I continued. The noise disappeared. Further ahead it came back the same, rhythmic. It wasn't scratching, it wasn't a bump from the bad road. It was something tapping wood with intention, like someone asking to get out. I pulled the truck to the side, got out carefully. The back was locked as we left it. No loose strap, no movement, nothing. I got back in with my body somewhat stiff, feeling my neck cold even in the midday heat. I drove another mile. The noise started again the same way. Tap, 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 tap. This time I didn't stop. I went to the end of the road, like someone running from something inside themselves. I convinced myself it was something with the wood engine resonance. I don't know. I arrived at the cemetery a little before 1. The caretaker, a small man with a worn cap and an expression burned by the sun, came out of the chapel shade and came to help me. I also called one of the men who had hired me. He was already waiting there, standing next to the gate. When it was time to take down the coffin, we saw the crack. It wasn't big, just a slit on the left side of the lid, as if the wood had been forced from the inside. but it wasn't there before. I'm sure, because I checked everything when I positioned it. The caretaker looked at me, didn't say anything, neither did the man who hired me. It was just silence and that crack. You could feel the moment called for more than words. One of the three suggested opening it for safety. It was done right there, with a key one of them brought. The lid came off easily, and inside there was nothing. Nothing, no cloth, no pillow, no those pulling handles, no smell of anything, just the raw bottom and our own silence. I froze, looked at the man who hired me. He stood still, then just said, "The funeral home must have switched the bodies." But he spoke with a calm that left me unsettled, as if he already knew, as if it wasn't news. I called the funeral home number he had given me before, and the woman who answered swore the body had been prepared, dressed and placed in the coffin by 2 employees and a social worker, that there were people who saw it, that there was no way it could be empty. That's when I understood there wouldn't be an answer, because not even the funeral home denied the body existed, and nobody there seemed surprised that it had disappeared. The caretaker was the only one who said something that stayed in my head until today. This is still going to cause trouble. And he left. We were left, me and the serviceman, standing next to an empty coffin in the middle of a small cemetery, surrounded by tall grass and crooked crosses. I don't even know how the job ended, if they took the coffin inside, if they buried it empty, or if they just left it there. I only remember I came back with my hand trembling on the steering wheel, because there I understood that this wasn't just an error. It wasn't a switch. It wasn't a mistake. It was something I wasn't supposed to have participated in, but I participated without knowing, without wanting. And to this day, I don't know what or who was knocking in there. On the way home, I left the radio off. The engine noise always helped me think, but that day it only interfered. Any crack from the truck bed, any tire popping on the gravel seemed like the knocking again. And that's how it came to my head, without surprise, without rush. Just that exact rhythm, as if it were a calm request, repeated, too exact to be coincidence. I went about 3 days without driving, and when I came back, it was only with open cargo. Nothing with doors closed, no freezer, no refrigerator, nothing that had a lid or lock, no moving for unknown people. It might seem like an exaggeration, but whoever hears that type of noise coming from inside a coffin and then discovers the coffin was empty changes their mind. Really changes. What tortures me isn't what I saw. It's what I didn't see. Because if there had been a body in there, fine. At least it would make sense, but what happened there doesn't. There's no explanation that closes the account. And what stops me to this day is that it's the emptiness. The emptiness inside the coffin. The emptiness in the faces of the men who hired me. The emptiness of the crack that appeared by itself as if there was force from inside out. Do you understand what that is? A thick wooden box, reinforced, secured with straps, and still a crack appears from the inside in a straight line. It was force applied from within. But from within, what if the coffin was empty? A week later, I went alone to the funeral home. I asked to speak with the person responsible for preparing the body that day. They told me she was off duty. I came back 2 days later. I spoke with her. She was a woman about 50-something years old who kept looking at me from the other side of the counter, as if she was already expecting that. I asked about the body. She confirmed. It was a 67-year-old man, rural area resident, known in the neighborhood with heart problems. She said the body was delivered with documents ceremonial clothes, and everything. Then I asked if she saw him being placed in the coffin. She took a while to answer, then said, "Yes, I did. I helped myself." But the way she spoke was more to end the subject than to confirm, the type of answer that doesn't invite more questions. And I understood there was something there she also didn't want to touch. The following month, I passed through that town 2 more times. In neither did I see any comment about confusion, error, or complaint. It was as if nothing had happened, as if a body had disappeared and nobody had missed it, or worse, as if someone wanted it to disappear. I spent a long time thinking about 1,000 theories, that the body was removed before transport, that I was used just to cover up a crime, that someone used that empty coffin to send some kind of message, those that we don't understand. But whoever is in the middle understands well. But what scares me most to this day is the possibility that there was someone in there while I was driving, and that they couldn't get out or shouldn't get out. Have you ever stopped to think about that? Whoever was knocking was alive. If they were, how did they disappear? If they weren't, then what was that exact, strong sound, seeming like a warning? Because it wasn't the sound of loose wood. I know that sound. I've worked with trucks for years. It was rhythm, it was intention, it was someone knocking or something. And it wasn't desperation, it was constant, like someone who doesn't scream, like someone who waits. After that day, I started observing more. Each job, each client, each face, I became more suspicious. I've already refused delivery of sealed urns. I've already denied funeral home jobs when I noticed crossed conversation. What got me that day wasn't fear. It was the feeling of having participated in something without wanting to, of having been the last piece of a chain that was set up, just waiting for someone to carry the silence. Because that's what stayed with me, the feeling that I carried someone's silence to the end of the road, that I helped bury a scream that shouldn't have been ignored, and that everyone involved already knew, except me. People say the worst thing is seeing something you shouldn't, but I learned there's something worse. It's not seeing, it's hearing and following yourself. Today, when I stop at some gas station and someone asks me if I've ever transported strange things, I answer with just one phrase. I once carried a coffin that knocked from inside, and when we opened it, there was nobody there. I always leave it at that. I don't explain more. Whoever laughs, let them laugh. Whoever stays quiet, that one understands. Because there are stories that don't need decoration, just silence. The same silence that was in that cemetery that day, surrounded by crooked crosses and dry grass. And every time I remember, it seems I still hear it too late. The first time I saw that number sewn inside the liver, I thought it was remnants of an old bandage. But it wasn't stuck, it was embroidered. And when I pulled the gauze with the forceps, I saw there was a 7 stitched by hand with dark blue thread right in the center. I'm used to wrong things, to medical improvisation, to poorly made scars, even to negligence. But that there wasn't an error, it was intention. This case started with a common autopsy. A 29-year-old woman, no external wounds, with a history of dependency, found alone in her own apartment in downtown Seattle. Probable cause pointed to substance use in excess. No signs of struggle, no visible injury, everything clean. She arrived to us like many others do. Technical file, date, location, seal, pending exams. But at the time of abdominal opening, there was an atypical resistance in the liver region. It wasn't natural. You could feel it in the blade. It was as if the tissue had been manipulated. Upon further investigation, I found an internal suture line, extremely fine, passing close to the hepatic parenchyma. A clean suture, internal, made with a small needle, almost surgical technique. That took my focus away for a second, because it wasn't part of our procedure and also didn't match any old surgery. There was no external scar. The line contained a small gauze wrap embedded with precision between the organ structures. Inside the gauze was a number stitched by hand, dark blue thread, number 7. Just that, nothing more. No note, no plastic, no blood, just that. The suture pattern was millimetric. The stitch was firm, centered, without tissue torsion. Work of someone with a steady hand, but without wanting to show off. The report was issued with mention of the strange material found. As always, I sent a copy to complementary forensics and one copy to the detective division handling the case. But it stayed at that. Nobody called me to talk. There was no new collection. It was filed as an isolated case. 3 months later, I received another body. A 41-year-old man, similar circumstances, found at home in Spokane. No apparent injury, presumed cause linked to a pre-existing condition. At the time of opening, I felt the same resistance, same internal point, same gauze, same location, but now the number was 8. That's when my head locked up. I did the entire procedure with a kind of dry nausea, as if I were opening an envelope that wasn't for me, because that clearly was for someone, and I was receiving it for the second time. The following week, I did an informal survey of the recent records from the last 6 months. No other body with anything similar until that moment. But then 2 months later, a child 7 years old, victim of a possible domestic accident in Tacoma. And there was the gauze, sewn between the lumbar vertebrae, pressing the nerves with surgical delicacy. Number 9. That's when I alerted the homicide division. They came to me, opened the files, crossed the records. Apparently no link between the victims. Adult woman, middle-aged man, now a child, no ties, no common history, no close geographical location, but all had the same suture, the same thread, and the same ascending order. When the 12th body arrived, something changed. It was a young man, early 20s, found in a commercial building in Portland, no external injuries. This time the number was inside the left lung. The suture passed close to the bronchus, made with a type of stitch that only I use. It's not a figure of speech. It's a type of closure I learned years ago in a course outside the country, and that I use on denser tissues when I want to avoid retraction without altering internal structure. I didn't teach this to anyone, didn't document it in an article. It's just mine. I commented with the team. They said it could be coincidence, but whoever works with repetition knows what a pattern is, and that there was being constructed with intention. The 13th body arrived on a Friday. The file said, male, 36 years old, death without witness, found in his apartment in Vancouver, Washington. I already opened with a stiffened stomach, but this time there was no number. There was a small tag, white, sewn with red thread, outside the pattern. The tag didn't say 13. It said my full name, first name, last name, medical license number. I couldn't continue that day. I asked another colleague to review the piece. He found it strange, of course, but put in the report that the gauze found contained characters that indicate the name of one of the professionals from the autopsy team. The police said this could be some provocation made by someone who had access to previous reports. But you understand what this means, right? The guy doesn't want to hide. He doesn't want to run. He wants to be understood, and not by everyone, just by me. There are people who kill to disappear. This guy kills to be read. And now, every time a new body arrives, I find myself waiting not for blood, not for wounds, but for the suture. Because I know that number 14 is going to come, and it won't be outside. It will be inside. And maybe it won't be a number anymore. Maybe it will be an answer or the next name. The pattern is escalating. Each body is a message. Each number a step closer to something I don't want to understand. The precision of the work, the knowledge of my personal technique, the fact that he knows my full credentials, this isn't random violence. This is communication through corpses, and I'm the only one who can read the language. Last week I found myself checking every body twice, looking for that telltale resistance in tissue, that perfect surgical thread in dark blue. My hands shake now when I make my own sutures, wondering if someone is watching, learning, copying not just my technique, but my very identity. The worst part isn't the fear of being next. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in this city, maybe in the next county over, number 14 is being prepared. And when it arrives on my table, it won't just be another body with another number. It will be the moment this killer, and I finally meet face to face, even if one of us is already dead. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this story caught you. Here on the channel we tell real stories, or at least stories so real they could have happened to anyone. And if you like this type of story, where fear doesn't come from screams, but from silence, detail and things nobody explains, then go ahead and subscribe. Be part of this community that grows every day with people who also feel chills where nobody else feels anything. Hit the notification bell, because the next story might be the one that makes you look differently at something you always thought was normal. When I close my eyes and think of the sound of a scream, what comes to me isn't the noise itself. It's the impact it makes in your chest, as if the scream hits something inside you and gets trapped there. It's been about 5 years. An old hospital, small town, late afternoon. And I was just doing my job. I did freight for a company that rented hospital equipment, wheelchairs, articulated beds, oxygen supports. That type of thing most people only see up close when they're in a bad moment of life. I had unloaded everything in the morning at a hospital in Phoenix, and at the end of the day, there was this delivery left in a small town near Flagstaff. It was supposed to be simple: stop at the back of the hospital, leave 3 big boxes at the service entrance and leave. But there was a delay with another client in the middle of the route, and when I got there, it was almost getting dark. The hospital was ugly, old, a grimy structure, stained with humidity, looked more abandoned than functioning. The main entrance was all dirty glass, but the order asked to leave the equipment in the back near the ramp where ambulances pass. I went there. Nobody appeared to receive it. I kept honking with the truck in neutral until a guy in gray uniform with a badge appeared. Without saying much, he pointed to the place where I could leave the boxes. I went, left everything right, signed the form, took a photo of the delivery, and climbed back to the cab. Up to there, routine. But then came what wasn't in the agreement. I was already engaging the gear to leave when I heard someone bang hard on the side of the truck. It wasn't an aggressive bang, but one of those from someone who needs you to stop. I looked in the rear-view mirror. It was a woman, white coat, hair tied in a bun, clipboard in hand. She looked like a doctor or nurse. She spoke with authority, said she needed help to take some equipment down the side ramp. Her tone caught me by surprise. It wasn't a request, it was an order, but it wasn't aggressive. It was that way of someone who's used to giving orders in a hospital environment, and I obeyed. I got out of the truck, asked what was to be done. She just pointed ahead, where the ramp began that gave access to the hospital corridors from behind. She said the equipment was already at the end of the descent, and that she just needed the truck down there to transfer. I didn't think twice. I got back in the cab and went maneuvering carefully. The access was tight, poorly lit, and the curve was tricky. The woman went ahead walking fast. You could only see the white coat swaying. She didn't look back. And then started to hit me a discomfort I can't explain. It wasn't fear, it was a type of strangeness. That back part of the hospital seemed stopped in time. The ceiling lights were failing. There was infiltration on the walls. No windows, no sound. Just the noise of the engine rumbling low and the tires rolling slowly, echoing on the descent walls. I looked to the sides and saw nobody, no marks, no professionals, nothing. It was as if that piece of the hospital was disconnected from the rest. The woman stopped near the end of the ramp, at a point where there was a dented steel door and a concrete platform. She pointed to the side and turned her face, as if saying, "It's here," but without saying anything. And it was at that moment it happened. Before I could engage the brake, the scream came from inside the hospital, not from above, not from a nearby corridor. It was from underground, right below, a woman's scream, a long scream from someone who was terrified. It wasn't pain, it was pure desperation. I stepped on the brake with everything. The truck gave a jolt and almost died there. My heart came to my throat. I turned my face to the woman's side and there was nobody there anymore. She wasn't there. I didn't hear steps. I didn't hear a door slamming, nothing. She simply disappeared. My breathing became heavy. I trembled. I tried to look through the mirrors, see if she had climbed somewhere or gone back up the ramp. That's when I saw in the side mirror, in the back part of the cab, the reflection of the window. And in it, her, the same woman. White coat torn, hair loose, mouth open in a scream, arms held behind her back. She was at the hospital's side door, hitting with her shoulder against the glass, screaming the same scream. But there in front of me, there was nobody. I looked at the empty passenger seat. I turned off the truck, ran out of the cab without even closing the door properly. I went to the side entrance. Nothing. Locked door, no sign of anyone, no marks, no voice. I stood there a few seconds, not knowing what to do. The only thing I heard was the noise of the engine still cooling down. My hands were ice cold. That's when a security guard appeared in the back corridor, uniformed, with a flashlight in hand. He asked me what I was doing in that area. He said it was restricted access. I explained everything. I talked about the woman, the ramp, the scream. I told about the reflection in the glass. He listened somewhat suspicious, but when I described the woman in more detail, the way she walked, the tone of voice, the white coat, he paled, was quiet a few seconds, then said just this. "You weren't supposed to be here. I'll check the cameras," and turned his back. I left. I didn't have the courage to ask anything more. I never accepted delivery at that hospital again. But to this day, every time I go down a tight descent, with dim light and stained walls, I look in the mirror not to see traffic, but to check if there's someone in the reflection who shouldn't be there on the road. We learn that the rearview mirror isn't just for seeing what's left behind. Sometimes it shows what we didn't see in front, or what we'd rather not have seen. After that day at the hospital, I went days without driving. I said it was flu, shoulder pain, any excuse, but the truth is I woke up in the middle of the night with the sound of the scream in my head. It wasn't a dream, it was memory. The way she appeared, the dry tone of voice, the clean white coat, and then in the reflection torn with marks on the sleeves as if it had been pulled. I tried to rationalize. I thought about hallucination from tiredness, optical illusion, light hitting wrong. But the more I tried to find a logical answer, the more my head went back to the detail of the badge. She wore a badge. I saw it. But I didn't read it, didn't fix the name, nor the hospital. It was as if my head had registered only the object, but not the information. And that bothers me to this day, because if I had read it, maybe I'd know if she really existed. A month later, on a trip to Tucson, I took advantage and stopped at a diner near that hospital. I went in, ordered coffee, and started conversation with the man at the register. I asked casually if the hospital still functioned. He said yes, but that some wings were closed because the building was too old. Then I talked about the side entrance, the ramp. I said I had made a delivery there a short time ago. The man looked kind of strange, said that through that access only the ambulance entered, and that they had locked the doors because of a case nobody talked about anymore. I asked what case it was. He hesitated, then said just, "A few years ago there was an employee who disappeared inside the hospital. She was on duty, disappeared between one corridor and another, never appeared again," and completed almost whispering. "They say she was taken, but nobody saw, nobody heard." At the time, the coffee went down bitter. I thanked him and left. I went back to the truck and stayed there a while with my hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine. The ramp, the white coat, the reflection. She asked me for help, but was it her or someone posing as her? Or worse, was she trying to ask for help, and I left, leaving behind the only chance she had? The security guard never called me. Nobody from the company touched the subject, but from time to time, when I'm alone in the truck, in some distant corner, the thought comes back. The scream hit the bodywork, that I'll never forget. And you know what gives me the chills most? At the time she appeared in the reflection screaming, she wasn't looking at nothing. She was looking at me as if saying, "You saw, you were here, you left me." After that, I created a silly habit, but one that relieves me. Every time I go down some dark ramp in a hospital or not, I look in the mirror before leaving. Not from fear of seeing something else, but from fear of not seeing, of having someone screaming right behind me, and I simply not noticing. Because in this world, there are things worse than seeing what you shouldn't. It's not seeing what needed to be seen and carrying that for the rest of your life. That woman in the reflection, torn coat and desperate eyes, she's still there somewhere in that hospital. And every time I pass by a medical complex with underground access, I wonder how many people are trapped in places they shouldn't be, screaming for help that never comes. The worst part isn't the supernatural, it's the human. It's knowing that somewhere, someone real might be asking for help, and we're too busy, too scared, or too convinced it's just our imagination to stop and really look. because sometimes the reflection shows us not ghosts, but the people we failed to save. You know, when you work with something for so long that you think you've seen everything. Well, I thought that way too. I've been in this hospital for more than 20 years, nursing technician. I work in the adult ICU, left wing, that quieter part of the old building, where the light seems like it never turns on properly, and the air conditioning never works as it should. It's the corner where we learn to speak softly even when we laugh, and also learn to respect the silences. I remember it was a Thursday shift change at 7 in the evening. The team was reduced because they had released a newer technician because of his sick daughter. We already knew the night was going to be tough. I mean, it wasn't chaos. But you know those nights when you feel something's going to happen. There's no explanation, but you feel it. Bed 4 had Mr. Raymond, 75 years old. Advanced heart failure condition. He was already in palliative care, pain controlled. He didn't talk much, but was awake. Just the way he breathed already said everything. Each time shorter, more contained, like someone who was already tired of even trying. I entered the room to check his vital signs. The light was kind of yellowish, as always. The sound of the monitor was the only noise in the environment. Then he turned his face slowly toward me, with effort. It seemed like just that already hurt. And he said very quietly, "Son, I'm holding a rope, but it's cutting my hand and I won't be able to hold on much longer." I stopped what I was doing, looked at him, didn't know if it was delirium, if it was metaphor, if it was just a way of speaking. But the way he looked at me, man, that wasn't confusion, it was quiet desperation. He knew what he was saying. And then he said, "Call a priest for me." I said I would see about that. I left the room kind of stuck, you know. It wasn't common, but it also wasn't anything absurd. We have a priest from the city who handles these cases, especially in the palliative care sector. I talked to the team. The head nurse called the family to authorize. They said it was fine. The priest arrived about 40 minutes later. That calm gentleman, already known to us, who always speaks slowly, as if asking permission to step on the floor. I stayed near the door with Rose, the shift nurse. The last rites were performed with the room almost completely dark, only the lamp light on. It was so silent you could hear even the crack of the window glass, that dry little sound of night cooling. When the priest made the blessing, Mr. Raymond closed his eyes and a tear rolled down, just one. When he opened again, there was a slight smile, one of those you don't know if it's relief or surrender, but it was serene, so serene that Rose held back tears. And I don't know until today if she cried because she knew what was coming next, or because she felt that was the most right goodbye she had ever seen. But it wasn't, not that day. That night he slept, didn't need sedative, didn't ask for anything, didn't complain, just slept. Rose and I passed by there about 3 times during the early morning, everything stable, more rhythmic breathing, blood pressure within expected, regular saturation. It seemed like his body had stopped fighting, but the strangest thing came the next day. The doctor who took the shift, a young guy, very technical, very proper, went to check bed 4 and came back with a furrowed brow, asking if anyone had changed any medication. Nobody had. Mr. Raymond was with stable vitals, improving little, but noticeably. In the next 48 hours, he was already managing to take some liquid by mouth. Then he accepted soup, began to look more, move his arms, ask to see his children. The afternoon doctor was so confused, she ordered the tests repeated. There was no explanation. 3 days later, the cardiologist who was following the case signed the transfer request to a regular room. Not for lack of severity, but because, well, he simply no longer had ICU criteria. There was nothing that justified invasion or isolation. He just needed observation. When we accompanied his discharge from the ICU, I remember he looked at me and said in a light way, almost joking, "I let go of the rope, son. I'm resting." I froze, not because he spoke calmly, but because I understood there what he meant on the first day. He wasn't talking about giving up, he was asking for peace. And it seems it was just getting that the body stopped fighting against itself. He stayed under observation for another week, then went home. His children always came to get the reports. There were 3, 2 women and a man. Simple people, they took care of him with affection. When I learned he had gone home, I confess I thought he would last little. It's not common to see a case like that and have a peaceful outcome, but he lasted 6 months to be exact. He lived longer than many healthy people out there. He had time to play with his grandchildren, watch television, walk around the yard, have morning coffee with the family, and on a Saturday night, sleeping. He went quietly, without effort, without noise, without machines beeping. Just him and the hammock swaying slowly in the corner of the porch. The eldest daughter called the hospital, then thanked us. She said he had said in recent days that he was no longer afraid, that he was waiting for real sleep to come. I'm not into mysticism. I believe in God, yes, but I was never one of those who see miracles in everything. We see a lot of things here inside, and over time we learn to separate what is faith and what is biology. But that wasn't cure, wasn't turnaround, it was truce. And sometimes that's all the body needs. The ICU at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Denver has a particular rhythm in the winter months. The snow piles up against the windows, creating these strange shadows that dance across the walls when the wind picks up. The heating system makes settling sounds that echo through the corridors. And there's something about the quality of light during those short December days that makes everything feel more fragile, more precious. I'd been working at St. Mary's for 22 years when Raymond Washington came into our care. He was a retired postal worker from the Curtis Park neighborhood, a man who'd spent 40 years walking the same routes, delivering mail through blizzards and heat waves, getting to know every family on his route by name. The kind of man who remembered birthdays and saved dog treats in his pocket for the pets he met along the way. Raymond's heart failure had been progressing for months, but he'd been stubborn about hospitalization. His daughter Carmen, a high school counselor at Manual High School, had been trying to convince him to seek treatment since the summer. But Raymond was old school Denver, the kind of man who'd rather suffer in silence than admit weakness. He kept saying he had work to finish, Carmen told me that first evening, as the snow began to fall outside the ICU windows. I never understood what he meant. He'd been retired for 8 years. But every time I brought up the hospital, he'd shake his head and say he wasn't ready yet, that he had something left to do. The thing about working palliative care is that you learn to recognize the signs of someone who's holding on by sheer will. The body wants to rest, but the spirit has unfinished business. Raymond had that look in his eyes, the kind of determined exhaustion that comes from carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear alone. When he asked for a priest that Thursday evening, I wasn't surprised. Father Miguel from Our Lady of Guadalupe had been coming to St. Mary's for 15 years. A gentle man in his 60s who spoke English with a slight accent and had hands that seemed to bring comfort just by their touch. The Latino families in the ICU always requested him specifically. But Raymond was African American, and his request caught me off guard. I heard about him from Mrs. Garcia in room 12, Raymond explained, his voice barely above a whisper. She says he listens. That's all I need right now, someone who listens. Father Miguel arrived just as the evening shift was settling into its quiet rhythm. The winter darkness comes early in Denver, and by 7 o'clock, the city lights were already twinkling like stars against the snow-covered landscape. He spent nearly an hour with Raymond, and I could hear the soft murmur of conversation through the closed door, punctuated by long periods of comfortable silence. When the priest emerged, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. That's a man who's been carrying something heavy for a long time, he told me. Sometimes the only medicine is forgiveness, especially forgiveness of oneself. I never learned exactly what Raymond confessed that night, but the change in him was immediate and profound. The tension that had kept his shoulders rigid for days seemed to melt away. His breathing, which had been labored and shallow, deepened into something that looked almost peaceful. But Raymond didn't die that night or the next or the one after that. Instead, something remarkable happened. His blood pressure stabilized, his oxygen saturation improved, and by the end of the week, he was asking for real food instead of the liquid nutrition we'd been giving him through his IV. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, our attending cardiologist, ran every test she could think of. The echocardiogram still showed significant heart damage. His ejection fraction hadn't improved, but somehow his body had found a way to function more efficiently. It was as if the mechanical problems with his heart remained the same, but the engine was running smoother. Sometimes, Dr. Hernandez told me as we reviewed Raymond's charts, the body responds to things we can't measure. Peace of mind, spiritual comfort, the relief of laying down a burden. We can fix mechanical problems, but we can't heal the soul. Maybe that's what happened here. Raymond spent another 10 days in the hospital before we felt comfortable discharging him. Carmen had arranged for home health care, oxygen equipment, a hospital bed in the living room of his small house near City Park. The whole family came to see him off. 3 generations crowded into his room, laughing and crying and making plans for Christmas dinner. "Thank you," Raymond said to me as the transport team prepared his wheelchair. "You helped me let go of that rope. I didn't know how heavy it was until I wasn't carrying it anymore." 6 months. That's how long Raymond lived after leaving our ICU. Carmen called me when he passed, wanting me to know that he died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family, with no pain and no fear. She said he'd spent those months doing all the things he'd talked about during those long winter nights in the hospital. Teaching his grandson to fish, helping his daughter paint her house, finishing a quilt he'd started for his new great-granddaughter. He kept talking about that rope, Carmen told me. Said he'd been holding onto guilt and regret for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be free. Whatever happened in that hospital room with Father Miguel, it gave him permission to put that burden down. I've thought about Raymond's case many times over the years since then. In nursing school, they teach you about the medical aspects of caring for terminal patients, but they don't really prepare you for the spiritual dimension. The way some people seem to need permission to die, while others need permission to live. Since then, every time a patient asks for something that seems simple but important, a phone call to an old friend, a visit from a pastor, a chance to write a letter they've been meaning to send for years, I try to make it happen. Because sometimes what looks like a medical crisis is really a spiritual emergency. And sometimes the most powerful medicine we can offer is the opportunity for someone to lay down the rope they've been holding onto for far too long. The winter Raymond died, I started keeping a small notebook in my pocket, writing down the things patients tell me in those quiet moments between medical procedures. Not for any official purpose, just to remember. Because in 20+ years of nursing, I've learned that the most important conversations often happen in the margins, in the spaces between vital signs checks and medication rounds. And sometimes, when I'm working a particularly difficult shift, when a patient seems to be holding onto life for reasons I can't understand, I remember Raymond's words about the rope. I remind myself that sometimes healing isn't about fixing what's broken, but about helping someone find the courage to let go of what's been holding them back. The body keeps its own time, follows its own wisdom. Our job isn't always to fight against that natural rhythm, but sometimes simply to create space for whatever needs to happen next, whether that's death or an unexpected reprieve, a final goodbye or a second chance at peace. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.